On a scorching afternoon in November 1532, a man who could neither read nor write stood at the edge of an empty plaza in the Peruvian highlands, waiting for a god to arrive. Francisco Pizarro commanded just 168 Spanish soldiers. They were hidden in the stone buildings surrounding the great square of Cajamarca, their horses saddled, their swords drawn, their hands trembling against the cold metal of arquebuses and crossbows. Across the valley, spread out like a living carpet upon the mountainside, 80,000 Inca warriors waited in perfect formation, their bronze spear points and war clubs catching the thin Andean light. They served a ruler who claimed direct descent from the sun itself, a man whose word was absolute law over 10 million souls, whose empire stretched 4,000 kilometers along the spine of the greatest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere. What happened in the next hour would destroy that empire, end a civilization that had taken centuries to build, and drench the ancient stones of Cajamarca in blood so deep that witnesses said it pooled in the plaza like rainwater after a storm. But this story does not begin in Cajamarca. It does not begin with Pizarro and his desperate band of fortune seekers. To understand what was destroyed that afternoon, to comprehend the full weight of what was lost, we need to go much further back. Centuries further. We need to climb higher, into the thin air above the clouds, to a time before there was an empire at all, before there were roads threading through impossible mountain passes, before there were storehouses filled with grain sufficient to feed armies for years, before stone was cut with such precision that a knife blade could not fit between the joints, and before runners carried messages across a continent faster than any horse. This is the story of the Inca, not only the story of their fall, which has been told many times and told well, but the story of their rise, how a small group of families huddled in a mountain valley became, in less than a century, the architects of the largest empire the Americas had ever known. It is a story of genius and cruelty, of visionary ambition and devastating hubris, of a people who looked at the most punishing landscape on earth and decided to make it theirs. The primary accounts of what we know come from a layered and imperfect archive. The Inca themselves kept no written records in the way Europeans understood writing. Their history was preserved by professional memory keepers called amautas, who maintained oral traditions with extraordinary precision, and by the quipas, those enigmatic systems of knotted strings whose full meaning we are still struggling to decode. After the Spanish conquest, several chroniclers attempted to record what remained of Inca oral history before it vanished entirely. Pedro Chiesa de Leon, a Spanish soldier who traveled the length of the former empire in the 1540s, produced one of the most detailed and sympathetic accounts. Garcilaso de la Vega, born in 1539 to a Spanish conquistador father and an Inca princess mother, wrote his royal commentaries of the Incas from memory and family tradition, preserving stories his mother and her relatives had told him as a child. Juan de Betanzos, who married an Inca noblewoman who had herself been one of Atahualpa's wives, recorded the narrative of the Incas from her direct testimony and that of other survivors. And the indigenous chronicler Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, writing decades after the conquest, produced a remarkable illustrated manuscript that preserves Inca history from an indigenous perspective. Together, these sources give us something precious and imperfect, the memory of a world that was deliberately unmade. To find the beginning of the Inca story, we must first understand the stage upon which it was set. And there is no stage on Earth quite like the Andes. Imagine a wall of rock and ice running the entire length of South America, from the tropical Caribbean to the frozen straits near Antarctica. The Andes rise abruptly from narrow coastal deserts on the west, climbing through successive ecological zones until they reach peaks over 6,000 meters high, then plunging down the eastern slopes into the Amazon basin, the largest rainforest on the planet. Within the span of 100 horizontal kilometers, you can pass from bone-dry desert where rain has not fallen in recorded history, through temperate valleys where maize and squash grow abundantly, up into high grasslands where only potatoes and hardy grains survive, and into frozen passes where nothing grows at all. Then down the other side into jungle so dense that the canopy blocks the sky. This is not a landscape that invites civilization. It is a landscape that dares it. The air at 12,000 feet contains roughly 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Water boils at a lower temperature. Crops that thrive in the valleys fail on the high plateaus. Building materials available at one altitude are absent at another. Rivers carve gorges thousands of feet deep, cutting valleys off from one another as effectively as oceans separate continents. The weather shifts without warning. A sunny morning can become a blinding snowstorm within an hour. Earthquakes shake the ground with terrifying regularity. Landslides erase entire hillsides as overnight, and yet people had lived here for thousands of years before the Inca appeared. The Andes were home to some of the oldest complex societies in the Americas. The Corral Supa civilization on the Peruvian coast dates back 5,000 years, making it contemporary with ancient Egypt. The Chavin culture, centered on its great stone temple at Chavin de Huantar, flourished around 900 BC and spread its artistic and religious influence across a vast area. The Mochi built enormous pyramids of adobe brick on the northern coast and produced some of the most sophisticated pottery and metalwork in the ancient world. The Tiwanaku civilization, based near the shores of Lake Titicaca at an elevation of nearly 4,000 meters, demonstrated that monumental architecture and complex administration were possible, even in the rarefied air of the high Altiplano. And the Wari Empire, expanding outward from its capital near modern Ayacucho, created what many archaeologists consider a template for the administrative systems the Inca would later adopt and perfect. By the time our story proper begins, around the year 1200 of the Common Era, these great predecessors had risen and fallen. Their ruins dotted the landscape. Their irrigation channels still carried water to fields, and their descendants still farmed the terraced hillsides and herded llamas across the high grasslands, but no single power controlled the central Andes. The highlands were a patchwork of competing ethnic groups and small kingdoms, each controlling its own valley or stretch of plateau, raiding its neighbors when opportunity arose, forming alliances that shifted like mountain weather. Warfare was endemic, low-level, and personal. Men knew their enemies by name. Into this world, the Inca emerged. Their homeland was the Cusco Valley, a broad, relatively flat basin in the southern Peruvian highlands at roughly 3,400 meters above sea level. By Andean standards, it was a generous landscape. The valley floor was fertile enough for maize. The surrounding hillsides could be terraced for potatoes, and the high pastures above supported herds of llamas and alpacas. Rivers converged here, providing reliable water. The climate, while cold at night, was mild enough during the day for comfortable habitation. It was not the richest valley in the Andes nor the largest, but it was well positioned. It sat at the intersection of natural travel routes running north-south along the mountain chain and east-west between the coast and the jungle lowlands. Whoever controlled the Cusco Valley controlled a crossroads. The Inca did not emerge from nowhere. They were one of perhaps a dozen ethnic groups competing for dominance in and around the valley. They spoke Quechua, a language family that predated them, and that was already widespread in the highlands. They were farmers and herders like their neighbors, organized into kin groups called Alis, each Alu tracing its descent from a common ancestor and holding land communally. They worshipped the sun, the earth, the mountains, and the thunder, as did most highland peoples. In their material culture, in their daily lives, they were not obviously remarkable. What set them apart at first was their mythology. Or perhaps more accurately, their mythology set them apart because it was designed to do exactly that. The Inca told two principal origin stories, and both share a common architecture. In the first and more widely known version, the creator god Viracocha, having made the world and set the sun and moon in the sky, commanded the first Inca, Manco Capac, and his sister wife Mama Oclo to emerge from the waters of Lake Titicaca. They rose from the sacred waters on the island of the sun, carrying with them a golden staff given to them by the sun god Inti, their divine father. Viracocha instructed them to travel north, and wherever the golden staff sank fully into the ground when dropped, there they should found their kingdom. Manco Capac and Mama Oclo wandered for a long time through the highlands, testing the earth at each new valley. The staff would not sink. The soil was too thin, the location too exposed, the omens incorrect. Finally, they reached a hill called Huanacauri overlooking a broad green valley. Manco Capac raised the golden staff and let it fall. It pierced the earth and vanished entirely, swallowed by the rich soil. This was the sign. The valley below was Cusco, and so the children of the sun descended into their promised home. The second origin story is perhaps even more revealing. It tells of 4 brothers and 4 sisters who emerged from 3 caves at a place called Pachacuti, roughly 30 kilometers south of Cusco. The caves were called Tambo Toco, and the central cave from which the royal siblings emerged was Capac Toco, the rich window. The brothers were named Ayar Manco, Ayar Cachi, Ayar Uchu, and Ayar Auca. The sisters were their wives. Together they set out toward Cusco, leading their people in search of fertile land. But the journey was marked by betrayal and elimination. Ayar Cachi was the strongest and most dangerous of the brothers, capable of hurling stones that shattered mountains. The other brothers, fearing his power, tricked him into returning to the cave of origin to retrieve sacred objects. Once he was inside, they sealed the entrance with boulders, entombing him forever. His muffled cries of rage, the story says, caused earthquakes that shook the valley. One by one, the remaining brothers were removed. Ayar Uchu was turned to stone at Huanacauri, becoming a sacred shrine. Ayar Auca flew ahead to Cusco and was also turned to stone, marking the spot where the city would be built. Only Ayar Manco remained. He entered the Cusco Valley with his sisters, drove out or absorbed the peoples already living there, and established the settlement that would become the navel of the world. He took the name Manco Capac, the first Inca. These myths are not fairy tales. They are political documents. Every element serves a purpose. The emergence from Lake Titicaca ties the Inca to the prestige of Tiwanaku, whose ruins stood on the lake's shores and whose legacy commanded respect throughout the Andes. The golden staff is both a divine instrument and an agricultural tool, a digging stick that tests the soil's fertility. The Pachacuti story is beneath its supernatural surface, a remarkably frank account of how power is consolidated. Brothers are eliminated through trickery, entombed, turned to stone. The strongest is removed first because he is the greatest threat. The message is clear. Among those who claim rulership, only one can survive. Power is not shared. It is concentrated by any means necessary in a single pair of hands. And this is the thesis that would drive everything that followed. In the Inca worldview, order was not a natural state. It was an achievement, always under threat, maintained only through the absolute authority of the Sapa Inca, the sole ruler, the son of the sun. Without that authority, there was chaos. The mountains would shake, the rains would fail, enemies would pour through the passes, the world itself would end. This was not metaphor to the Inca, it was cosmological fact. The ruler held the world together. His body was the body of the empire. For roughly 2 centuries after Manco Capac, the Inca kingdom was small, vulnerable, and frequently at war. The early Sapa Incas, their names preserved in the oral tradition and recorded by Spanish chroniclers, read like a catalog of local strongmen. Sinchi Roca, Loca Yupanqui, Meta Capac, Capac Yupanqui, Inca Roca, Yahuar Huacac, Viracocha Inca, 8 rulers spanning perhaps 200 years, though the exact chronology remains debated. Their domain rarely extended beyond the Cusco Valley and its immediate surroundings. They fought the Canaz, the Canches, the Ayarmacas, and a dozen other groups whose names have faded from all but specialist histories. They won some of these fights and lost others. They built alliances through marriage, sealed them with gifts, and watched them dissolve when circumstances changed. This was the world of the pre-imperial Inca, And it is worth pausing here to understand what daily life looked like in these early centuries, because the transformation that was coming would be so radical, so swift, and so total that without a baseline, its scale becomes incomprehensible. The early Inca lived in small settlements of stone and thatch houses clustered around a central plaza. The houses were simple, single-room structures with walls of fieldstone mortared with mud, roofed with ichu grass that grew abundantly on the high puna above the valley. There were no windows. Light entered through the doorway, which was typically low enough that an adult had to stoop to enter. The interior was dark, smoky from the cooking fire, and sparse. People slept on piles of llama wool blankets on the floor. They stored dried potatoes called chuño in the corners, along with dried meat called charqui, the word from which our English word jerky descends. The smell of a highland home was the smell of smoke, damp earth, drying meat, and the faint lanolin scent of wool. Meals were simple and extraordinarily well adapted to the environment. The potato, in its hundreds of varieties, was the staple of the high-altitude diet. The Inca and their neighbors had developed a process for freeze-drying potatoes using the intense cold of highland nights and the strong sun of highland days, alternately freezing and desiccating the tubers until they became light, portable, and virtually imperishable. Stored chuño could last years. Maize was grown at lower altitudes and was considered a prestige food, used especially for making chicha, a mildly alcoholic beer that was the social lubricant of Andean society. No gathering, no ceremony, no negotiation, no work project took place without chicha. Quinoa provided protein. Llama meat supplemented the diet, though llamas were far more valuable alive as pack animals and wool producers than dead. The rhythms of life were dictated by the agricultural calendar, which was itself dictated by the altitude. Each ecological zone had its own planting and harvest cycle, and highland communities maintained access to multiple zones through a system the anthropologist John Murrah called the vertical archipelago. A single community might farm potatoes on the high slopes, maize in the valley, and coca and tropical fruits on plots far down the eastern escarpment toward the jungle. Families or small groups would travel days to tend these scattered holdings, maintaining a network of ecological niches that provided the full range of nutrients and materials needed for survival in a landscape where no single zone offered everything. Labor was communal. The Alu, the kin group, was the fundamental unit of social and economic organization. Land belonged to the Alu collectively and was redistributed among families according to need. When a field needed plowing, the Alu plowed it together. When a house needed building, the Alu built it together. When a young couple married, the Alu provided their initial household goods. This was not charity, it was obligation, woven into the fabric of reciprocity that held Andean society together. You gave labor today because you would need labor tomorrow. You shared your surplus because one day you would face shortage. The principle was called Aini, and it operated at every level of society, from the household to, eventually, the empire itself. Religion permeated everything. The Inca worshipped the sun Inti as their supreme deity and divine ancestor, but the landscape itself was alive with sacred presence. Mountains were Apu's powerful spirits that controlled weather and fertility. Springs and rivers had their own animating forces. Unusual rock formations, ancient trees, the places where lightning had struck, all these were huacas, sacred objects or locations that demanded acknowledgement and offering. The Inca did not distinguish between the natural and the supernatural. The world was a single integrated system in which human action, divine will, and natural process were inseparable. To plow a field was a spiritual act. To build a wall was to negotiate with the living stone. To cross a mountain pass was to enter the domain of a conscious, watchful power that could choose to let you live or kill you with a sudden storm. Death was not an ending. The Inca practiced elaborate ancestor veneration. The bodies of the dead, carefully mummified and wrapped in textiles, remained active members of the community. They were brought out for festivals, seated in places of honor, offered food and chicha, consulted on important decisions. The mummies of former Sapa Incas, called Malquis, retained ownership of all the lands and wealth they had accumulated during their lifetimes. Their descendants, organized into royal lineages called Panicas, maintained their estates, managed their property, and spoke on their behalf. A dead Sapa Inca was, in economic and political terms, still a very powerful figure. His mummy sat on its throne. Servants attended to it. Its word, channeled through its living descendants, still carried weight. This practice would have profound and ultimately devastating consequences for the empire, because each new Sapa Inca inherited the title but not the wealth of his predecessor. Every new ruler began his reign effectively landless. The dead king's Panaka kept everything. The living king had to acquire his own estates, his own storehouses, his own wealth. And the fastest way to do that was conquest. Every new Sapa Inca faced an imperative written into the very structure of succession. Expand or be diminished, conquer or be consumed by the accumulated wealth and influence of the dead, but that imperative would not reach its full expression for generations. Through the reigns of those early kings, the Inca kingdom grew slowly, cautiously, absorbing neighbors through a mix of warfare, diplomacy, and marriage alliance. They were patient, these early Inca. Or perhaps more accurately, they had no choice. They were surrounded by rivals as tough and as hungry as themselves. The Cusco Valley was contested ground, and holding it required constant vigilance. The threat that would change everything came from the northwest. The Chanca were a powerful confederation of highland peoples based in the region around modern Andahuaylas, roughly 100 kilometers west of Cusco. They were aggressive, expansionist, and by the early 15th century they had set their ambitions on the Cusco Valley itself. The Chanca had already defeated several neighboring groups and absorbed them into their confederation. Their warriors were reputed to be fierce and numerous. Their leaders were ambitious. And around the year 1438, they marched on Cusco. The Sapa Inca at this time was Viracocha Inca, an elderly ruler who had, by most accounts, exhausted his appetite for war. When word reached Cusco that a massive Chanca army was approaching from the west, Viracocha Inca made a decision that would have ended the Inca story before it truly began. He chose to flee. Taking his designated heir, a son named Inca Urco, along with a portion of the court, the old king abandoned Cusco and retreated to a fortress in the hills. The city was in chaos, the population prepared to scatter. The Chanca army was close now. Scouts reported tens of thousands of warriors moving through the passes, their war drums audible in the distance, a low rhythmic thunder that echoed off the valley walls and made the very air seem to vibrate with menace. But one man refused to leave. He was a younger son of Viracocha Inca, not the heir, not the favorite, by some accounts barely acknowledged by his father. His given name was Kusi Yupanqui. He was, by the standards of royal succession, expendable. He had no army, no treasury, no legitimate claim to command. What he had was a conviction that the children of the sun did not run. He planted himself in Cusco. He rallied what forces remained, calling on the common people of the city, the servants, the younger warriors who had not followed the old king into retreat. He sent urgent messages to neighboring groups promising them rewards, threatening them with divine vengeance, appealing to their self-interest. If Cusco fell, they would be next. The accounts of what followed are half history and half mythology, and the line between the two is impossible to draw with certainty. The chroniclers record that on the night before the battle, Kusi Yupanqui prayed alone on a hillside above the city. The sun god Inti appeared to him in a vision, promising victory. The very stones of the battlefield, Inti declared, would rise up and become warriors to fight alongside the Inca. This prophecy of the Pururaucas, the stone soldiers, would become one of the foundational myths of the empire. What is historically certain is this: the Chanca attacked Cusco, and they were defeated. The battle was savage, fought in the fields and on the hillsides around the city. Kusi Yupanqui led from the front, by all accounts fighting with a ferocity that bordered on the reckless. The details are blurred by time and propaganda, but the outcome was decisive. The Chanca were routed. Their leaders were killed or captured, their army scattered into the mountains. Cusco was saved. And in the aftermath of that salvation, Kusi Yupanqui did something that revealed in a single act the nature of the man and the nature of the empire he was about to build. He did not celebrate quietly. He did not defer to his father. He gathered the bodies of the slain Chanca warriors and laid them on the ground before the gates of Cusco. Then he demanded that his father, the Sapa Inca who had fled, walk over them to re-enter the city. Step on the dead, he was saying. Acknowledge who saved what you abandoned. Viracocha Inca refused. Perhaps he understood that to walk that path was to surrender his authority forever. His designated heir, Inca Urco, also refused. And in that refusal, the old order ended. Kusi Yupanqui took a new name. He called himself Pachacuti. It is a word that means world turner, or more precisely, he who remakes the earth. In Andean cosmology, a Pachacuti is a cataclysmic transformation, an overturning of the existing order, a death and rebirth of the world itself. The man who chose this name was not merely claiming a throne, he was declaring that history had broken in half, that everything before him was the old world and everything that followed would be new. He was right. What Pachacuti built in the decades that followed was not simply a larger kingdom, it was a fundamentally new kind of state. Unlike anything the Andes had seen before, unlike anything the Western Hemisphere had seen before, he took the small, embattled chiefdom of Cusco and transformed it in a single generation into an empire that would eventually encompass modern Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and significant portions of Colombia, Chile, and Argentina. The speed of this transformation has no parallel in the pre-Columbian Americas, and few parallels anywhere in the ancient world. But we will come to the conquests. We will come to the roads and the storehouses and the armies and the territories. First, Pachacuti had to remake his capital, because before he could build an empire, he needed the world to see what an empire looked like. And so he turned his attention to Cusco itself, and what he envisioned there would become one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world. The night air settles over the highlands. The stars at this altitude burn with a clarity impossible at lower elevations, thick and bright, and so numerous that the Inca saw not only the constellations formed by stars, but the dark constellations formed by the gaps between them, the shapes of animals visible in the black dust of the Milky Way, the llama, the fox, the toad, the serpent, all picked out in shadow against the luminous river of stars the Inca called Mayu, the celestial river that mirrored the earthly rivers flowing through their valleys below. Somewhere in Cusco, in the years after his great victory, Pachacuti looked up at those same stars and saw not just the heavens, but a blueprint. The city he would build would mirror the cosmos. Its streets would align with the movements of the sun. Its temple would capture the light of the solstice. Its very shape, when seen from the surrounding hills, would trace the outline of a puma, the sacred animal of royal power. Its head formed by the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman on the hill above the city, its body stretched along the valley, its tail tapering to the point where two rivers converged. He was going to remake the world, and he was going to start with stone. Pachacuti began by demolishing Cusco. The old city, the cramped settlement of fieldstone and thatch that had served his ancestors for generations, was not worthy of what the Inca would become. He ordered it leveled. Homes, storerooms, the modest temples of earlier reigns all were pulled apart, their stones scattered, their foundations dug up and removed. The people of Cusco were relocated to temporary settlements around the valley's edge while the king reimagined their world from bare earth. What rose in its place was something the Andes had never seen. Pachacuti did not merely build a city, he engineered a statement of cosmic authority rendered in stone, water, and sacred geometry. The heart of the new Cusco was the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun. Its name meant golden enclosure, and the Spanish chroniclers who first entered it would struggle to find language adequate to what they found. The walls of the temple's inner sanctum were lined with sheets of gold, hammered thin and fitted so precisely that they covered the stone like skin. Not decorative accents, not gilded highlights. Entire walls, floor to ceiling, sheathed in gold that caught the morning light and transformed the interior into something that seemed to burn from within. In the central chamber stood a great golden disc, shaped to represent the face of Inti, positioned so that the sun's first rays at the June solstice would strike it directly and scatter reflected light throughout the temple. Around this central shrine were smaller chambers dedicated to the moon, the stars, thunder, and the rainbow, each decorated in its own sacred metal. The moon's chamber was lined with silver. The stars glittered with arrangements of gold and silver together. But the Coricancha's most remarkable feature may have been its garden. Adjacent to the temple, the Inca had created a garden in which everything was made of precious metal. Life-size stalks of maize, crafted in gold, stood in rows with silver leaves and golden ears. Golden butterflies perched on golden flowers. A shepherd, rendered in gold, watched over a flock of 20 life-size golden llamas standing in golden grass. There were golden fountains from which chicha was said to flow during ceremonies. Even the soil between the golden plants was represented by carefully crafted lumps of gold. This was not mere ostentation. Every element had cosmological meaning. Gold was the sweat of the sun. Silver was the tears of the moon. The golden garden was not a treasury display. It was a model of the universe in its perfected state, the world as it existed in the divine realm, where decay and death had no dominion and the cycles of growth never faltered. To enter the Coricancha was to step briefly out of the mortal world and into the eternal one. The message to any visitor, whether ally, subject, or potential enemy, was unmistakable. The Inca did not merely rule the earth. They had a direct line to the divine order that sustained it. To oppose them was not rebellion. It was blasphemy. Radiating outward from the Coricancha like the spokes of a wheel ran an invisible system of lines called seques. There were 41 of these conceptual lines, dividing Cusco and the surrounding landscape into a vast sacred geography. Along each seque were arranged specific huacas, sacred sites ranging from springs and stone outcrops to temples and ancestral shrines. The total number of huacas organized along the seque system was approximately 328, a number that some scholars believe correlates with the lunar calendar. Each huaca was the responsibility of a specific social group within Cusco who maintained it, made offerings at it, and performed ceremonies according to a precise ritual calendar. The seque system transformed the entire landscape around Cusco into a living map of social obligation, religious practice, and political hierarchy. Where you lived, which huacas you tended, which seque your elu was assigned to, all of this defined your place in the cosmic and political order simultaneously. There was no distinction between the two. The city itself was divided into two halves, Hanan Cusco, Upper Cusco, and Huron Cusco, Lower Cusco. This dual division reflected a fundamental Andean principle that the Inca elevated to the organizing logic of their entire civilization. Everything existed in complementary pairs, upper and lower, male and female, sun and moon, left and right, conquest and diplomacy. These pairs were not equal in a modern egalitarian sense, but they were mutually necessary. Hanan was associated with the conquering masculine principle, Huron with the administrative feminine one. The tension between the two halves was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The energy generated by complementary opposition was what kept the world in motion. Pachacuti laid out Cusco's streets in a grid pattern centered on a great central plaza, the Hapcaipata, which could accommodate enormous ceremonial gatherings. The buildings facing the plaza were constructed of the finest ashlar masonry the Inca would ever produce. The stones were cut from diorite and limestone, shaped with hammer stones and bronze tools, and fitted together without mortar in joints so tight that the blade of a knife could not penetrate them. The technique was extraordinary. Each stone was individually shaped to fit its neighbors, meaning no two stones in a wall were identical. The surfaces were polished smooth. The walls inclined slightly inward, giving them a subtle trapezoidal profile that made them extraordinarily resistant to earthquakes, a constant threat in this seismically active landscape. When the earth shook, as it did regularly, the stones would shift slightly and then settle back into position, their precisely angled faces guiding them home. Spanish colonial buildings erected on top of Inca foundations would collapse in earthquakes while the Inca stonework beneath them survived intact. 5 centuries later, it still does. The engineering extended beneath the surface. Pachacuti redesigned the drainage of the entire valley. The 2 rivers that flowed through Cusco, the Safi and the Tulumayo, were channeled into stone-lined canals that ran beneath the city streets, carrying away waste and preventing the flooding that had plagued the old settlement. Fresh water was brought in through a system of aqueducts. The streets themselves were paved and kept immaculately clean. Spanish soldiers arriving in 1533 would compare Cusco favorably to any city in Spain, a comparison that would have astonished their countrymen back home, who assumed that the peoples of the New World lived in primitive squalor. Above the city, on the steep hill to the north, Pachacuti began the construction of Sacsayhuaman. This was the fortress temple that formed the puma's head in his great urban design, and it was a project of almost incomprehensible ambition. The complex featured 3 massive terrace walls built in a zigzag pattern, each tier rising above the last like the teeth of a saw. The stones used in the lowest tier were the largest ever moved by any civilization in the pre-Columbian Americas. Some weighed over 100 metric tons. One stone, still visible today, stands nearly 9 meters tall and weighs an estimated 300 metric tons. These blocks were quarried from sites up to 35 kilometers away, transported over rugged terrain without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, shaped with stone and bronze tools, and fitted together with the same knife-edge precision as the finest walls in the city below. How they accomplished this remains one of the great engineering questions of the ancient world. The Inca had no iron, they had no steel, they had no wheels, no pulleys, no cranes. They had human labor, organized at a scale that staggered the imagination, and they had an understanding of stone, leverage, and earthen ramps that equaled or exceeded anything in the contemporary Old World. The chronicler Cieza de Leon, who saw Sacsayhuaman before it was dismantled for its stones by Spanish colonists, called it the most impressive building he had ever seen, more impressive even than the Roman aqueducts of Spain. He could not understand, he wrote, how human beings without iron tools could have cut and moved such stones. He concluded that the devil must have helped them. The devil had nothing to do with it. What built Sacsayhuaman was something far more remarkable than supernatural intervention. It was the mita. The mita was the labor tribute system that Pachacuti developed into the engine of imperial expansion, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything the Inca achieved. In a society without money, without markets, and without writing, labor was the fundamental unit of value. The Inca state did not tax its subjects in goods or currency, it taxed them in time. Every household in the empire owed a certain number of days of labor per year to the state. This labor could take many forms: agricultural work on state-owned land, service in the army, construction of roads, bridges, storehouses, and temples, weaving of textiles for state distribution, running messages along the road network. The specific obligation varied by region and by the needs of the state, but the principle was universal and non-negotiable. You gave your labor, and in return the state guaranteed your survival. It fed you while you worked. It maintained the storehouses that would sustain your community during famine. It defended your borders against raiders. It maintained the irrigation systems and terraces that made your agriculture possible. This was not, by modern standards, a voluntary arrangement. But neither was it by Andean standards, an alien one. The mita was built on the same principle of reciprocal obligation, aini, that had governed Ailu life for centuries. The Inca genius was in scaling it up. What had been a communal obligation among families became an imperial obligation among peoples, and the scale of what it produced was staggering. At the height of the empire, the Mida labor force could mobilize tens of thousands of workers for a single project. Sacsayhuaman alone, according to Cieza de Leon, required 20,000 workers laboring in rotating shifts for several decades. Other chroniclers put the number higher. The workers were organized with military precision. They were grouped by province, by alu, by skill. Specialists quarried the stone. Other teams transported it. Still others shaped and fitted it. Engineers directed the operations. Administrators tracked the labor contributions of each community, recording them on quipus to ensure that no group bore more than its share. The workers were fed from state storehouses, clothed from state textile supplies, and given chicha in quantities that the chroniclers describe with something approaching awe. The entire operation was a logistical achievement on par with the construction itself. And Sacsayhuaman, massive as it was, represented only a fraction of Pachacuti's building program. Simultaneously with the fortress, he was constructing royal estates throughout the region surrounding Cusco. The most famous of these is Machu Picchu, though attributing its construction to Pachacuti specifically remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What is clear is that during his reign and those of his immediate successors, an explosion of elite architectural construction transformed the sacred valley of the Urubamba River into a landscape of terraced agricultural complexes, astronomical observatories, ritual bathing sites, and royal retreats of extraordinary sophistication. Ollantaytambo, with its massive terrace walls and unfinished sun temple featuring 6 enormous monoliths of pink granite transported from a quarry across the valley and up a steep mountainside. Pisac, with its curving agricultural terraces and precision-built astronomical temples perched on a ridge above the Urubamba. Moray, with its mysterious concentric circular terraces that may have served as an agricultural research station, each ring creating a slightly different microclimate for experimental crop cultivation. These were not merely impressive buildings. They were experiments in the integration of architecture with landscape on a scale the world had rarely seen. The Inca did not build on the land, they built with it. Their terraces followed the natural contours of hillsides, amplifying and perfecting what nature suggested. Their water channels captured springs and directed them through sequences of fountains and basins that combined engineering utility with aesthetic grace. Their temples were oriented to catch the light of solstices and equinoxes, framing mountain peaks and celestial events in doorways and windows cut with deliberate precision. The landscape was not a backdrop to Inca architecture, it was a collaborator. But stone and water and gold, however magnificent, do not make an empire. Roads do. Pachacuti understood, perhaps more clearly than any ruler of his age anywhere in the world, that an empire is only as strong as its ability to move information, armies, and supplies across its territory. And so, alongside the rebuilding of Cusco and the great construction projects, he initiated the creation of the Chapacñan, the Great Road, a network of paved highways that would eventually extend over 30,000 kilometers, stitching together every corner of the empire with the capital like a circulatory system serving a single heart. The main trunk of the road ran north-south along the spine of the Andes, with a parallel route along the coast. Lateral roads connected the two, climbing from sea level to over 4,000 meters and descending again, crossing terrain that would challenge a modern highway engineer. In the highlands, the roads were typically 3 to 4 meters wide, paved with flat stones and bordered by low walls. In the desert stretches of the coast, they were wider, sometimes 15 meters across, marked by posts and low walls to prevent sand encroachment. In the most extreme terrain, where the road had to cross sheer cliff faces, the Inca carved ledges into the living rock, creating narrow paths with drops of hundreds of meters to one side. Where the road crossed marshland, they built raised causeways. Where it encountered rivers too wide to bridge, they built suspension bridges of braided fiber cables, some spanning distances of over 50 meters, swaying high above gorges that fell away into white water and shadow. The most famous of these bridges crossed the Apurimac River at a point where the gorge was so deep and narrow that the river below appeared as a thin silver thread. The bridge was rebuilt every year or two by the local communities as part of their Mida obligation. Hundreds of people would gather to braid new cables from the fibers of the maguey plant, each cable as thick as a human body. The old bridge would be cut away and the new cables would be hauled across the gorge and anchored to massive stone abutments on either side. A roadway of wooden planks was then laid across the cables and secured with smaller ropes. The entire process took several days. The bridge would sway alarmingly under the weight of travelers, and the Inca reportedly required that only a few people cross at any one time. But it held. It carried armies, llama trains loaded with supplies, and the messages of empire across a chasm that would otherwise have required days of detour. Along the roads, at intervals of roughly 15 to 25 kilometers, the Inca built tambos, way stations that served as rest stops, supply depots, and administrative centers. The tambos ranged from simple shelters in remote areas to substantial complexes in populated regions, with sleeping quarters, kitchens, storerooms, and corrals for llama trains. Larger tambos functioned as regional administrative centers where state officials collected tribute, resolved disputes, and coordinated the Mita labor force. The system ensured that an army could march the entire length of the empire without carrying supplies, replenishing at each tambo along the route. An individual traveler, provided they carried the proper authorization, could do the same. And running along these roads faster than any army, faster than any llama train, faster than anything else in the pre-Columbian Americas, were the chasqui. The chasqui system was the Inca Postal Service, a relay network of trained runners stationed at small posts roughly 2 to 3 kilometers apart along the major roads. When a message needed to be sent, a chasqui would run at full speed to the next post, deliver his message, verbal or encoded in a quipu, to the waiting runner there, and that runner would sprint to the next post and so on, day and night without stopping. The system could cover 250 kilometers in a single day. A message could travel from Quito to Cusco, a distance of nearly 2,000 kilometers, in less than a week. Fresh fish from the Pacific coast could reach the Sapa Inca's table in Cusco, high in the mountains, within 2 days of being caught. The Spanish, when they learned of this system, were frankly amazed. It was faster than anything they had in Europe. The combination of roads, tambos, storehouses, and the chasqui network created something that had never existed in the Americas before. A centralized state that could project power, move resources, and communicate decisions across a territory stretching from modern Colombia to central Chile, a distance equivalent to that from London to Baghdad, all of this without writing. All of this without money. All of this without the wheel. The Quipus deserve a moment of focused attention here, because they were the technology that made this administration possible, and they remain one of the most fascinating and frustrating artifacts of the ancient world. A quipu was a collection of colored strings, sometimes hundreds of them, attached to a main cord and knotted at precise intervals. The knots recorded numerical values using a base 10 positional system that was mathematically identical in principle to the one we use today. The position of a knot on the string indicated its decimal place value. Different colors indicated different categories of information. A quipu could record census data, tribute payments, military inventories, calendrical information, and much more. Specialized officials called quipucamayaks maintained these records, and their training was extensive. What remains debated and deeply contested among scholars is whether Quipus could encode narrative information, not just numbers. Some researchers believe that certain Quipus functioned as something approaching a writing system, encoding names, stories, and verbal messages in patterns of color, knot type, and string direction that we have not yet learned to read. Others maintain that Quipus were strictly numerical, and that any narrative information they carried was mnemonic, prompting the trained reader to recall a specific passage of memorized text rather than encoding the text itself. The question may never be fully resolved. The Spanish destroyed thousands of quipus during the colonial period, considering them potential instruments of idolatry or sedition. Fewer than 1,000 survive, and no living tradition of reading them remains unbroken. What we know with certainty is that the Quipu system, whatever its full capabilities, was sufficient to administer an empire of 10 million people across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. That alone is an achievement that demands respect. Pachacuti was now old, though the chronicles do not agree on his age. He had remade his capital, begun the road network, systematized the emitia and the administrative structures of the empire, and established the ideological framework that would justify Inca rule for generations. But he had also done something else, something that perhaps mattered more than any building or road. He had conquered. The military expansion that Pachacuti initiated, and that his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui would continue, was the fastest imperial expansion in the pre-Columbian Americas. In the space of roughly 50 years, from the defeat of the Chanca around 1438 to the death of Tupac Inca Yupanqui around 1493, the Inca state grew from a regional polity controlling the Cusco Valley to an empire encompassing virtually the entire western coast and highland region of South America. The scale of this expansion is difficult to overstate. Tupac Inca Yupanqui alone is credited with conquering more territory than any single Inca ruler, pushing the empire's northern border into modern Ecuador and its southern border deep into Chile and northwestern Argentina. The Inca method of conquest was not a single strategy, but a graduated system of escalating pressure. The first approach was always diplomacy. Emissaries would be sent to a targeted polity bearing gifts, fine textiles, precious objects, and quantities of chicha. They would explain in polite and measured terms the benefits of joining Tawantinsuyu, the Inca name for their empire, meaning the four parts together. They would describe the roads, the storehouses, the protection from enemies, the access to goods from distant ecological zones. They would emphasize the reciprocal nature of the arrangement. The Sapa Inca was generous. He gave as well as took. His subjects were fed, clothed, and defended. If diplomacy failed, the gifts became more pointed. Larger delegations arrived accompanied by visible military escorts. The message shifted subtly from invitation to warning. The emissaries would describe in careful detail what had happened to other groups who had refused the Inca's friendship. They would mention the size of the armies available to the Sapa Inca. They would note the storehouses full of weapons, the roads that could deliver those armies to any point in the empire within days. If the warnings were ignored, the army came. And the Inca army was a formidable instrument. At its peak, it could field forces of over 100,000 men organized into units based on the decimal system, with officers commanding 10, 50, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 soldiers. The troops were equipped with slings, which in Andean hands were devastatingly accurate weapons capable of killing at significant range. They carried clubs, maces, and bronze-headed axes. They wore quilted cotton armor and helmets of wood or woven cane. They fought in disciplined formations, supported by logistical trains of llamas carrying food and equipment, resupplied at regular intervals from the Tambo network. They could march 40 kilometers a day on the imperial roads, arriving at the point of conflict fresh, fed, and organized while their opponents were still mobilizing. The battles themselves could be savage. Andean warfare was not the ritualized, limited conflict that some earlier scholars imagined. It was bloody, determined, and pursued to decisive conclusion. The Inca used their numerical superiority and superior logistics to overwhelm resistance. Captured enemies were sometimes treated with calculated brutality to discourage future resistance. There are accounts of trophy heads, flayed skins made into drums, and skulls fashioned into drinking cups. Pachacuti himself is credited in some chronicles with decorating one of his estates with the remains of defeated enemies, but the Inca preferred submission to slaughter. A conquered people who surrendered peacefully were treated far more gently than those who resisted. Their local leaders were often left in place, provided they swore loyalty to the Sapa Inca, sent their sons to Cusco for education, meaning indoctrination, and accepted the installation of Inca administrators to oversee tribute collection and labor mobilization. The local huacas were respected, though the Inca sun cult was installed alongside them. Local elites were given prestige goods, Inca-style textiles, fine ceramics, and coca leaf, binding them into the imperial system through material reward. Those who resisted received a very different treatment. The Inca practiced a policy called mitma, the forced resettlement of populations. Communities that proved rebellious were broken apart. Portions of the population were uprooted and relocated to distant parts of the empire, their lands given to loyal settlers from elsewhere. The displaced people found themselves surrounded by strangers, cut off from their ancestral huacas, their sacred mountains, the bones of their ancestors. Their identity was shattered by design. Loyal populations were moved in to replace them, creating a patchwork of ethnic enclaves that could not coordinate resistance because they shared no language, no kinship, and no loyalty except to the distant authority of Cusco. It was cultural engineering on a scale that anticipated methods European colonial powers would employ centuries later. And binding all of this together, lubricating every interaction between the state and its subjects, was the principle of reciprocity. The Inca state demanded much. It demanded labor, obedience, and the surrender of local autonomy, but it gave in return, and it gave visibly, publicly, in ways designed to make the exchange feel balanced even when it was not. The state fed its Mita workers generously. It distributed textiles, one of the most valued commodities in the Andean world. It provided chicha in enormous quantities at every state-sponsored event, and there were many such events. Festivals, construction projects, military campaigns, agricultural ceremonies, all were accompanied by feasting and drinking on a scale that reinforced the message. The Sapa Inca provides. The Sapa Inca is generous. Your labor is repaid. The Sapa Inca himself embodied this principle in person. When receiving visiting lords or negotiating with potential allies, the Inca ruler distributed gifts with calculated lavishness. He poured chicha from gold cups. He draped fine kumbi cloth, the exquisite tapestry-weaved textile that was among the most precious objects in the Inca world, around the shoulders of those he wished to honor. He offered women of noble birth as wives to cement alliances. Every act of generosity was an act of power because the gift created an obligation. To accept was to become a debtor. To refuse was to declare enmity. By the time Pachacuti grew old and passed the active command of the armies to his son Tupac Inca Yupanqui, the empire he had created was already the largest political entity in the history of the Americas, and it was still growing. But the old man's legacy was not only territorial, it was conceptual. Pachacuti had taken the raw materials of Andean civilization, the Ailu, the Mita, the principle of reciprocity, the worship of the sun and the mountains, the vertical archipelago, and fused them into a coherent imperial ideology. The Inca did not simply conquer. They reorganized. They classified. They counted and recorded. They built and connected. They took the organic, decentralized patterns of highland life and imposed upon them a structure of breathtaking ambition and terrifying efficiency. A structure in which every person had a place, every place had a function, and every function served the center. The world had been turned. The Pachacuti had come. Now the world turner's son would carry the transformation to its furthest limits, pushing the boundaries of Tawantinsuyu to the edges of the possible, into jungles that swallowed armies whole, across deserts where no water flowed, and up against peoples who would rather die than kneel. The empire was about to reach its zenith. And at the zenith, as with all things built by human ambition in defiance of human limitation, the first cracks would begin to appear. Tupac Inca Yupanqui was not his father. Where Pachacuti had been the visionary, the architect, the man who looked at a provincial town and saw the navel of the world, his son was something simpler and in some ways more dangerous. He was a conqueror of limitless appetite and extraordinary competence, a man who understood that his father's grand design required fuel, and that fuel was territory, people, and the tribute they produced. He had been groomed for this role from youth. Pachacuti, whatever his other qualities, understood the fragility of succession and the necessity of preparing his heir through direct experience rather than courtly education. Tupac Inca Yupanqui had commanded armies while still a young man, leading campaigns in the northern highlands that extended Inca control into territories that had never acknowledged Cusco's authority. He had proven himself not merely brave, but strategically gifted, capable of adapting his approach to the specific character of each opponent. Against settled agricultural peoples, he used the graduated diplomacy-to-force model his father had perfected. Against mobile, dispersed groups in the eastern jungle margins, he developed new tactics emphasizing rapid movement and the establishment of fortified outposts. He learned, as all successful empire builders must, that the same method does not work everywhere. When Pachacuti finally transferred full authority to his son, probably sometime in the 1470s, though the precise date is uncertain, the empire already stretched from Lake Titicaca in the south to the central highlands of what is now Peru. Tupac Inca Yupanqui would more than double it. His first great campaign pushed north. The target was the Kingdom of Chimor, centered on the coastal city of Chan Chan in what is now northern Peru. Chimor was the most powerful state on the Pacific coast and the Inca Empire's only serious rival. Chan Chan itself was an enormous urban complex, its walls decorated with elaborate friezes, its compounds housing tens of thousands of people. The Chimu had their own imperial traditions, their own administrative systems, their own skilled artisans whose gold work and silver work were among the finest in the Americas. They were not a tribe to be absorbed. They were a civilization to be overcome. Tupac Inca Yupanqui approached the problem with characteristic patience. He first secured the highlands above the coastal valleys that sustained Chimor, cutting off the kingdom's access to the water sources upon which its irrigation-dependent agriculture relied. The Chimu were a desert people. Their great cities existed because of elaborate canal systems that brought snowmelt from the Andes down to the arid coastal plain. Control the water in the highlands, and you controlled life on the coast below. It was a strategy that required geographic understanding as much as military force, and it worked. Faced with the slow strangulation of their water supply, the Chimu ruler eventually submitted. His craftsmen, the finest metalworkers in the Americas, were relocated to Cusco, where their skills were absorbed into the imperial workshops. Chan Chan was left standing but diminished, its political power broken, its artistic traditions appropriated and redirected to serve the glory of the Sapa Inca. The conquest of Chimor was strategically decisive, but what happened next entered the realm of legend. The chronicles record, with varying degrees of detail and reliability, that Tupac Inca Yupanqui organized a massive maritime expedition. Sailing on balsa wood rafts from the coast of Ecuador, he and a large force voyaged westward into the Pacific Ocean and reached islands that the chroniclers call Avachumbi and Ninachumbi. He returned months later, the stories say, with dark-skinned people, gold, a brass throne, and the hide and jawbone of a horse. The identity of these islands has been debated for centuries. The Galapagos are the most commonly proposed candidates, though some scholars have suggested destinations as far as Polynesia. The horse remains, if accurately reported, pose a particular puzzle, as horses were not present in the Americas at this time. Skeptics dismiss the voyage entirely as royal propaganda, but the tradition is persistent, recorded by multiple chroniclers from independent sources, and the Inca were unquestionably capable of the maritime technology involved. Balsa rafts of the type used along the Ecuadorian coast were sophisticated sailing vessels, equipped with centerboards that allowed them to tack against the wind, and they were far more seaworthy than European observers initially assumed. Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition in 1947, whatever its other scientific shortcomings, at least demonstrated that Pacific crossings on balsa rafts were physically possible. Whether Tupac Inca Yupanqui actually reached distant Pacific islands or merely sailed to nearer offshore destinations, the expedition reveals something essential about the Inca imperial mentality at its zenith. The land was not enough. The mountains, the deserts, the jungles, the entire western edge of South America from the equator, nearly to the 40th parallel, all of this had been conquered or was in the process of being conquered. And still the Sapa Inca looked outward toward the horizon, searching for more. The southern campaigns were equally ambitious. Tupac Inca Yupanqui pushed the empire's frontier deep into what is now Chile, crossing the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, and extending Inca authority as far south as the Mal River, nearly 1,000 kilometers south of the desert crossing. Here, for the first time, the Inca encountered a people they could not defeat. The Mapuche, the indigenous people of south-central Chile, fought the Inca to a standstill. They were dispersed, fiercely independent, and fighting on terrain they knew intimately. They had no capital to capture, no king to dethrone, no centralized infrastructure to seize. The Inca model of conquest, which depended on the existence of a structured society that could be decapitated and reorganized, found no purchase against a people whose strength lay precisely in their lack of centralization. The Mal River became the empire's southern boundary. It would never be crossed. The eastern frontier presented different but equally intractable challenges. The Andes' eastern slopes descend into the Amazon basin, a world of dense tropical forest, extreme humidity, insect-borne disease, and indigenous peoples whose warfare tactics were perfectly adapted to the jungle environment and utterly unlike anything the highland Inca had trained for. Multiple attempts to push into the lowlands met with disaster. Armies that marched confidently down the eastern escarpment found themselves swallowed by vegetation so thick that formations became meaningless, where arrows came from invisible attackers and retreated into green silence before any response was possible. Tropical diseases ravaged troops whose bodies had adapted to the cold, dry air above 12,000 feet. The logistics that made Inca armies so effective in the highlands, the roads, the tambos, the llama trains, were useless in terrain where roads turned to mud within days and llamas sickened and died in the lowland heat. The Inca eventually established a series of fortified outposts along the jungle fringe, marking the boundary between the ordered world of Tawantinsuyu and the wild, unconquered forest below. These outposts served as trading stations where highland goods, bronze tools, textiles, and highland foodstuffs were exchanged for the jungle products the Inca valued most: coca leaf, tropical bird feathers in brilliant colors used for elite ceremonial garments, hardwoods, medicinal plants, and animal skins. The jungle peoples remained independent, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, always beyond the reach of the Mita and the Quipu. They were a living reminder that the Inca claim to universal dominion had limits, however strenuously the state ideology denied it. By the time Tupac Inca Yupanqui died, around 1493, a date whose coincidence with Columbus's first voyage to the Americas carries an irony too heavy for the historians who note it to ignore, Tawantinsuyu was the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere and one of the largest on Earth. Its population numbered roughly 10 million people. Its territory encompassed snow-capped peaks, tropical forests, coastal deserts, high-altitude grasslands, fertile river valleys, and everything in between. Its road network was longer than Rome's at its height. Its storehouses contained enough food to feed the population for years. Its administration, conducted entirely without writing or money, managed the labor, tribute, and welfare of hundreds of distinct ethnic groups speaking dozens of languages across a territory so vast that a message took a week to cross it even at the pace of the chasqui runners. It was by any measure one of the great achievements of human civilization, and it was held together by a system so elegant, so efficient, and so utterly dependent on a single point of authority that the removal of that point would bring the entire structure crashing down with a speed that still astonishes. The succession of Huayna Capac, son of Tupac Inca Yupanqui, brought the empire to its absolute zenith and planted the seeds of its destruction in a single reign. Huayna Capac was born into a world his grandfather had built and his father had expanded to its natural limits. The great conquests were largely complete. The frontiers had reached the barriers that geography, climate, and human resistance had placed in the Inca path. The Mapuche in the south, the jungle peoples in the east, the scattered tribes of the far north. All had proven that Tawantinsuyu could not expand indefinitely. For a state whose succession system demanded that each new ruler acquire his own wealth through conquest, this was not merely a strategic problem, it was an existential one. Huayna Capac spent much of his reign in the northern reaches of the empire, personally overseeing campaigns in what is now Ecuador and southern Colombia. He established a second capital at Tumibamba, present-day Cuenca in Ecuador, and spent so many years there that it became, in practical terms, his primary residence. Cusco, the sacred navel of the world, the city his grandfather had rebuilt as a cosmic statement, was increasingly governed in his absence by administrators and royal kinsmen. This geographic separation between the ruler and his traditional seat of power was unprecedented, and it created a political fault line that would soon crack open. Huayna Capac fathered many children. The Sapa Inca maintained a vast household of wives, concubines, and secondary unions that served diplomatic as much as personal purposes, but two sons mattered more than the rest. Huáscar was born in Cusco to a woman of impeccable royal lineage, his mother a full sister of Huayna Capac, as Inca royal tradition preferred. He was raised in the sacred city, surrounded by the panicas of former rulers, educated in the traditions that stretched back to Manco Capac. He was Cusco's son in every sense. Atahualpa was born in the north, probably in Quito. To a mother who was not of Inca royal blood, some sources say she was the daughter of a conquered northern lord. He was raised among soldiers in the war camps of his father's northern campaigns, educated not in the ritual subtleties of the Cusco court, but in the hard arithmetic of military command. The two brothers represented not just different claims to succession, but different visions of what the empire was. Huáscar was the traditionalist, rooted in Cusco's sacred geography, backed by the ancient Panacas, committed to the religious and ceremonial order that legitimized Inca rule. Atahualpa was the modernizer, if that word can be applied, the man of the frontiers, backed by the empire's most battle-hardened armies, committed to the practical exercise of power over its ritual expression. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it was structural, written into the very contradictions of the system Pachacuti had built. But before that rivalry could ignite, something far worse arrived. Around 1527, Huayna Capac was in the north when he fell ill. The sickness came on quickly and was devastating. His skin erupted in sores. His fever climbed, his body burned. He died within days. The disease killed him, and killed with him an enormous number of his court, his generals, his administrators, and his soldiers. It spread south along the very roads and tambo network that had given the empire its strength, carried by the same efficient communication and travel systems that had made Tawantinsuyu a marvel of organization. Thousands died, tens of thousands. Perhaps hundreds of thousands. The estimates vary wildly, but the impact was catastrophic and undeniable. The disease was almost certainly smallpox. It had arrived in the Americas with Columbus's second voyage in 1493 and had spread through indigenous populations with the relentless efficiency of a fire burning through dry grass. It reached the Inca Empire years before any Spaniards set foot on Inca soil, traveling along trade routes and through populations that had never been exposed to Old World pathogens and possessed no immunological defense against them. Huayna Capac may never have seen a European in his life. He was killed by their germs nonetheless. His death, without a clearly designated successor, the chroniclers disagree on whether he named an heir on his deathbed, and if so, which son he favored, plunged the empire into a crisis from which it would never recover. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa was the Inca Empire destroying itself. It was devastating, sustained, and fought with a ferocity that reflected the total nature of the stakes. There could be no compromise, no power sharing, no negotiated settlement. The Inca system permitted only one Sapa Inca. The sun had only one sun on Earth. Two suns was a cosmological impossibility. One brother would rule, the other would cease to exist. The war lasted approximately 3 years, from roughly 1529 to 1532. The details are complex, the chronology uncertain, and the accounts contradictory in many specifics. But the broad arc is clear. Huáscar, based in Cusco, initially held the advantage of legitimacy. He was recognized by the southern half of the empire and by the powerful Panacas of the capital. He controlled the heartland, the sacred sites, the traditional centers of imperial administration. Atahualpa, based in the north, held the advantage of military experience and the loyalty of the empire's most seasoned fighting forces, the armies that had spent years campaigning under his father's direct command. The early engagements went poorly for Atahualpa. His generals suffered defeats, and he himself may have been captured briefly before escaping, an episode whose details are heavily colored by later propaganda from both sides. But the northern armies regrouped, and Atahualpa's commanders, particularly the brilliant General Chalcuchimac and the equally formidable Quisquis, launched a sustained offensive southward that broke Huáscar's forces in a series of increasingly decisive battles. The final battle was fought near Cusco itself. Huáscar's army was destroyed. The Sapa Inca was captured alive, and his capture was followed by an act of calculated extermination that revealed the darkest possibilities of the Inca system. Atahualpa's generals, acting on his orders, or at least with his approval, systematically murdered Huáscar's family, his wives, his children, his close relatives. The killing extended to members of the Panacas that had supported Huáscar's claim. Women were hung by their hair with their children dangling from their feet. Infants were killed before their mothers' eyes. The scale of the slaughter was designed not merely to eliminate political rivals, but to erase an entire faction of the royal lineage from existence. The Inca who recorded these events for Spanish chroniclers in later years spoke of the Civil War with a horror that transcended the passage of decades. It was for them the true Pachacuti, the true world turning far more devastating than the Spanish conquest that followed. The empire had turned its own machinery of organized violence inward, and the result was a wound that could not heal. When the killing was done, Atahualpa was the undisputed ruler of Tawantinsuyu. He was at Cajamarca, in the northern highlands, resting his army and consolidating his victory. The empire was shattered but still intact. The roads still functioned. The storehouses still held grain. The administrative system, though weakened by the loss of so many experienced officials to war and smallpox, still operated. Given time, a ruler of Atahualpa's ability might have rebuilt. He had time measured not in years but in days, because Francisco Pizarro was already climbing the mountains toward him. The man who would destroy the Inca Empire was born in the late 1470s in Trujillo, a small town in the Extremadura region of western Spain. Extremadura was Spain's hard country, dry, poor, and proud, a landscape of sun-baked plains and crumbling castles where the soil gave little and the people expected less. It bred soldiers the way the Andes bred potatoes, prolifically and out of apparent stone. Hernán Cortés, conqueror of the Aztecs, was from Extremadura. So were many of the men who would follow Pizarro to Peru. They came from families with lineage, but no wealth, pride, but no prospects, the dangerous combination that fills armies and launches empires. Pizarro was illegitimate, the son of a minor nobleman and a woman of humble birth. His father acknowledged him barely, if at all. He received no education, no inheritance, no training for any profession except the one that required none: war. He could not read. He could not write his own name. What he could do was endure. The early chroniclers describe a man of extraordinary physical toughness, patient to the point of stubbornness, capable of absorbing setbacks that would have broken more educated and more fortunate men. He was not brilliant. He was not charismatic in the way that Cortés was charismatic. He was simply relentless. He arrived in the Americas in 1502, part of the great wave of Spanish adventurers who followed Columbus's discovery into the Caribbean and the mainland beyond. For 25 years, he knocked around the edges of the Spanish colonial world, participating in expeditions, acquiring modest grants of land and labor, never achieving the wealth or fame that he saw other men seize. He was present during the early exploration of the Pacific coast of Colombia and Panama. He heard the rumors that filtered up from the south, stories of a rich kingdom in the mountains, a land where gold was as common as iron, where the ruler ate from plates of precious metal, and the temples blazed with it. These rumors had been circulating for years, growing more specific and more tantalizing with each retelling. Spanish expeditions probing southward along the Pacific coast had made contact with trading rafts from the Inca-influenced zone, carrying textiles, ceramics, and metalwork of a quality that suggested a civilization far more sophisticated than anything the Spanish had yet encountered outside of Mexico. Pizarro listened to these stories with the patience of a man who had waited his entire life for a chance worthy of the risk. In 1524, he formed a partnership with Diego de Almagro, a fellow soldier of fortune who was, if anything, even more obscure in his origins than Pizarro, and Hernando de Luque, a priest who provided financial backing and ecclesiastical respectability. Together they organized the first of what would become 3 expeditions southward. The first 2 were disasters, short of supplies, battered by storms, ravaged by disease, and hostile encounters with coastal peoples. Pizarro's small force was reduced to a handful of starving men huddled on a swampy island off the Colombian coast. It was here that the episode occurred that would define Pizarro's legend. Facing mutiny, with his men demanding to return north to Panama, Pizarro drew a line in the sand with his sword. On one side, he said, lay Panama, poverty and safety. On the other lay Peru, wealth and danger. He stepped across the line. 13 men followed him. The rest went home. The famous 13, as Spanish history would call them, continued south on a single leaking ship. And what they found changed everything. They reached the coastal city of Tumbes, at the northern edge of the Inca Empire. And for the first time, Europeans set eyes on a civilization that rivaled anything in the Old World. They saw stone buildings, organized agriculture, roads, textiles of extraordinary quality, and gold. Abundant, casual, everywhere gold. Used for decoration, for eating utensils, for the walls of temples, gold treated not as a rare treasure to be hoarded, but as a common material to be worked and displayed. Pizarro returned to Spain to seek royal authorization for a full-scale conquest. He arrived at the court of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, carrying samples of Inca gold and silver, textiles, and ceramics. He told the king of a rich empire, ripe for conquest and conversion, waiting in the mountains of the south. Charles granted him the title of Governor and Captain General of Peru, a territory that existed at this point only in Spanish imagination and Inca reality. Pizarro recruited soldiers, including 4 of his half-brothers, and sailed back to the Americas. He landed on the coast of Peru in 1532 with 168 men, 67 horses, and a few small cannons. Against him stood an empire of 10 million souls, defended by armies that had spent a generation fighting one of the most brutal civil wars in the history of the Americas. The numerical absurdity of this confrontation demands explanation. And the explanation is not simple. It is not, as older histories sometimes suggested, a story of European superiority meeting indigenous primitivity. The Inca were not primitive. They had built one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. Their engineering, their administration, their agriculture, their logistics were in many respects more advanced than anything in contemporary Europe. The story of what happened at Cajamarca is not a story about civilization meeting savagery. It is a story about specific technological advantages, devastating biological warfare, catastrophic timing, and a collision between 2 systems of understanding the world that produced a result neither side could have predicted. But those are matters for the next chapter of this account. For now, Pizarro was climbing the mountains, and Atahualpa was waiting at Cajamarca, and the distance between them was closing with every step. The Sapa Inca knew the strangers were coming. His Chasqui network, still functioning despite the ravages of civil war, brought him regular reports of the bearded men with their strange animals moving up the mountain roads. Atahualpa had received descriptions of the Spanish from the coast. He knew about their horses, which no Inca had ever seen before. He knew about their metal armor and their weapons that made thunder. He knew there were fewer than 200 of them. That last fact is crucial to understanding what happened next. Atahualpa was not afraid. He had just won a war against an army of tens of thousands. He He commanded warriors who had fought their way from Quito to Cusco, who had destroyed a Sapa Inca and his entire court. 168 strangers, however exotic their appearance and technology, were not a military threat in any framework Atahualpa understood. They were a curiosity, perhaps an opportunity, perhaps future subjects, or useful allies, or sources of interesting trade goods. They were not an army. He allowed them to approach Cajamarca. He did not order them destroyed in the mountain passes, where a few hundred boulders rolled from the heights would have ended the story before it began. He did not send his army to meet them. He waited in the posture of a ruler receiving visitors, secure in his power, surrounded by his thousands, curious to see these strangers face to face. It was the most consequential misjudgment in the history of the Americas. The afternoon of November 16, 1532, began with silence. Cajamarca sat in a broad valley in the northern Peruvian highlands, a town of perhaps 2,000 stone and adobe buildings arranged around a vast central plaza. The plaza was large enough to hold several thousand people, bordered on three sides by long, low buildings with multiple doorways, and on the fourth by a wall. Beyond the town, rising in terraces of farmland and then bare rock, the mountains climbed toward peaks still carrying the last of the season's snow. The sky was immense, the high-altitude light sharp and unforgiving, the kind of light that reveals every detail with merciless clarity. Pizarro had entered the town the previous evening, finding it largely deserted. The inhabitants had withdrawn to Atahualpa's camp, located on a hillside about a league outside the town, where the Inca army was encamped around hot springs where the Sapa Inca was purifying himself after the exertions of his Civil War victory. From the edges of Cajamarca, the Spanish could see the Inca camp spread across the hillside, and what they saw drained the color from their faces. The chronicler Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's young cousin, wrote that the campfires of Atahualpa's army covered the hillside like stars in the sky. Francisco Lopez de Jerez, the expedition's secretary, recorded that many of the Spaniards urinated on themselves from sheer terror that night, though they would deny it afterward. These were hard men, veterans of frontier violence, men who had survived Caribbean fevers and Central American jungles, and the slow attrition of years spent at the edges of the known world. They were afraid in a way that most of them had never experienced. Pizarro spent that night planning. He had studied the accounts of Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire, and whether through direct reading, since he was illiterate, someone must have read the accounts aloud to him, or through conversations with men who had served in Mexico, he understood the essential lesson. Cortés had neutralized a vastly superior force by seizing the person of the emperor Moctezuma and using him as a puppet to control the empire. The strategy had worked because the Aztec state, like the Inca state, concentrated so much authority in a single ruler that his capture paralyzed the entire system. The body of the emperor was the body of the state. Seize one and you seize the other. Pizarro distributed his men among the buildings surrounding the plaza. The cavalry, perhaps the most decisive military advantage the Spanish possessed, was divided into two groups and hidden in the long buildings on either side of the square. The infantry, with their swords and pikes and arquebuses, concealed themselves in the buildings along the third side. A small group of men with two small cannons called falconets positioned themselves on a raised platform overlooking the plaza. The plan was simple, brutal, and required absolute precision in its execution. Atahualpa would be invited into the plaza for a meeting. When he arrived, the Spanish would spring their trap. The morning passed. Pizarro sent a small embassy to Atahualpa's camp, led by Hernando de Soto and later reinforced by Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's half-brother. They rode their horses directly into the Inca camp, an act of calculated audacity designed both to gather intelligence and to display the strange animals that no Inca had ever seen. De Soto reportedly spurred his horse to a gallop directly toward Atahualpa's person, pulling up so close that the horse's breath stirred the fringe on the Sapa Inca's forehead. Atahualpa did not flinch. Several of his attendants, however, drew back from the animal, and those men were reportedly executed that evening for displaying cowardice in the presence of the divine ruler. The Sapa Inca agreed to visit the Spanish in Cajamarca the following day, or perhaps he was already planning to visit and the Spanish embassy merely confirmed the schedule. The accounts differ. What matters is the agreement. The hours of waiting were agony for the concealed Spanish. From their hiding places they could hear and occasionally see the Inca procession forming on the hillside and beginning its slow descent toward the town. It was an enormous procession. Thousands of people moving in ordered ranks, advancing with the deliberate pace of ritual rather than urgency. Atahualpa was in no hurry. A god does not rush to meet curious strangers. The procession entered Cajamarca in the late afternoon. First came sweepers, clearing the road of every pebble and twig. Then came dancers and singers, rows of men in ceremonial dress performing choreographed movements and chanting songs of praise. Then came ranks of soldiers in livery, their uniforms designating their units and their provinces of origin. And finally carried on a magnificent litter borne on the shoulders of 80 lords dressed in rich blue tunics, came Atahualpa himself. The litter was covered in the feathers of tropical birds, brilliant greens and blues and reds forming patterns of such intricacy that the Spanish chroniclers, men not given to aesthetic rapture, paused in their accounts to describe its beauty. Atahualpa sat on a small stool within the litter, wearing a crown of wool and feathers and a collar of enormous emeralds. His face bore the studied impassivity that Inca royalty cultivated as a physical discipline. To show emotion was to reveal weakness. The son of the sun was as unmoved as the mountains themselves. The plaza filled with Inca attendants, thousands of them. The Spanish, watching through gaps in the doorways and windows of their hiding places, counted and recounted and felt their bowels loosen. The attendants were largely unarmed or carrying only ceremonial weapons. The bulk of the Inca army remained outside the town. This detail was crucial, and it is possible that Atahualpa had deliberately left his military forces outside Cajamarca as a gesture of peaceful intent, or perhaps of contempt for the small number of strangers he was about to receive. It may also be that he wanted to capture the Spanish alive for questioning, which would be more difficult if his soldiers overwhelmed and killed them in a melee. His motivations are ultimately unknowable. What is known is that when the trap was sprung, the people in the plaza were mostly unarmed. Pizarro sent forward a single man to meet the Sapa Inca. He chose Fray Vicente de Valverde, a Dominican priest who served as the expedition's chaplain. Valverde approached the litter carrying a Bible and a crucifix. Through an interpreter whose linguistic competence for such a task was, by most accounts, deeply inadequate, Valverde delivered what the Spanish called the requerimiento, a formal statement that had been read to indigenous peoples across the Americas for 2 decades. It declared that the Pope, as God's representative on earth, had granted sovereignty over these lands to the Spanish crown. It demanded that the indigenous ruler accept the authority of the Christian God and the Spanish king. It warned that refusal would justify the use of force. The absurdity of this scene is difficult to overstate. A priest speaking through an incompetent translator was explaining a religion and a political system that had no referent in Inca experience to a ruler who considered himself the son of the sun and the supreme authority over the known world. The theological and legal concepts embedded in the requerimiento, papal authority, the divine right of European kings, the Trinity, original sin, were not merely unfamiliar to Atahualpa, they were untranslatable. The interpreter was working across a linguistic and conceptual chasm that no amount of goodwill or skill could have bridged in a few minutes of shouted conversation in a crowded plaza. Atahualpa listened. He asked, according to several accounts, where the priest's authority came from. Valverde indicated the Bible. Atahualpa took it, examined it, held it to his ear. It did not speak to him. He threw it on the ground, or perhaps he dropped it, or perhaps he handed it back dismissively, and it fell. The accounts diverge on the exact mechanics, but they agree on the consequence. The holy book of the Christians ended up on the stones of Cajamarca, and Valverde retreated to Pizarro shouting that the Indians had rejected the word of God, that absolution was granted, that the Spanish should attack. Whether Pizarro needed this pretext or had always intended to attack regardless is a question the sources cannot definitively answer. What is certain is that he gave the signal. A falconet fired. The blast of the cannon, a sound no one in the plaza had ever heard before, ripped through the air like the cracking of the sky, and then the doors of the buildings burst open and hell poured into the square. The cavalry came first, the horses lunging through the doorways at full gallop, the riders screaming the Spanish war cry of Santiago. The effect was annihilating. No one in the plaza had ever seen a horse before, let alone a horse at full charge carrying an armored man with a steel lance. The animals were enormous by Inca standards, snorting, screaming, their hooves throwing sparks from the paving stones, their riders towering above the crowd like mounted demons. The psychological shock alone would have been paralyzing. Combined with the cannons, the arquebuses whose smoke and thunder added to the apocalyptic confusion, and the sudden eruption of armored men swinging steel swords into an unarmed crowd, the effect was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The Inca in the plaza had nowhere to run. The buildings surrounded the square on 3 sides. The 4th side was a wall. The crowd, thousands strong, compressed against itself in panic. Men and women were crushed underfoot. The cavalry rode into the mass of people and cut them down with strokes that severed limbs and split skulls. The steel swords of the Spanish, tempered and sharpened, cut through the cotton and leather of Inca clothing as if through cloth, which is precisely what it was. Inca bronze weapons, where they existed at all in this largely ceremonial crowd, could not penetrate Spanish steel armor. The technological asymmetry was total. It was not a contest between armies. It was an industrial process applied to human bodies. Through the chaos, Pizarro himself fought toward the litter. This was the objective. Everything depended on reaching Atahualpa. The bearers of the royal litter displayed a courage that every chronicler, Spanish and indigenous alike, acknowledges with something approaching awe. As bearers were cut down, others stepped forward to take their places. Hands reached up from the mass of dying men to hold the litter aloft. They did not let the Sapa Inca fall. They could not conceive of it. To let the Son of the Sun touch the ground, to allow his sacred person to be defiled by contact with the common earth amid blood and chaos, was an impossibility more absolute than their own deaths. They died holding him up. New hands replaced them, and those hands died too. Pizarro reached the litter. In the struggle to drag Atahualpa from it, a Spanish soldier swung a sword at the Sapa Inca, and Pizarro himself blocked the blow with his arm, receiving the only Spanish wound of the entire engagement. Atahualpa was pulled from the litter and seized. He was alive. He was a prisoner. The killing continued after his capture. Spanish cavalry pursued the fleeing Inca into the fields beyond the town, riding them down as they ran. The killing went on until darkness made it impossible to tell friend from enemy. When it was over, the plaza of Cajamarca was carpeted with the dead. The Spanish accounts estimate between 2,000 and 10,000 Inca killed that afternoon. Not a single Spaniard died in the fighting, aside from the wound Pizarro himself received while protecting his captive. The disparity is almost impossible to credit, and it has led some historians to suspect exaggeration. But the fundamental dynamics are not in dispute. An unarmed or lightly armed crowd was attacked without warning by men on horseback wielding steel weapons and supported by gunpowder artillery. The crowd was trapped in an enclosed space with no escape route. The attackers were armored and mounted, rendering them virtually invulnerable to any resistance the trapped crowd could offer. In such conditions, the kill ratio is not a measure of military superiority. It is a measure of how long the killing lasted before the victims could flee. Atahualpa sat in a stone room in Cajamarca, a prisoner of men he had expected to receive as curiosities. The world had turned again, but this time the turning was not a new era of Inca glory. It was the beginning of the end of the Inca world itself. In captivity, Atahualpa proved to be as shrewd a negotiator as he had been a military commander. he quickly understood what the Spanish valued above all else: gold. Their eyes betrayed them every time they saw it. Their hands reached for it involuntarily. They weighed it, tested it, argued over it. They were, by Inca standards, insane on the subject. Gold was not to the Inca a form of currency. It had no exchange value. It was sacred because it was the sweat of the sun, precious because of its beauty and its divine associations, but it was not wealth in the way the Spanish understood wealth. Wealth in the Inca world was measured in labor, in reciprocal obligation, in the number of people who owed you service, and the storehouses of food and textiles that demonstrated your ability to provide. Gold was decoration. Gold was religion. Gold was not power. But to the Spanish, gold was everything. And Atahualpa offered them everything they wanted. He promised to fill the room in which he was held with gold to a height that he indicated by stretching his arm up the wall, a line roughly 7 feet from the floor. He promised to fill a smaller adjoining room twice over with silver. In return, the Spanish would release him. Pizarro agreed. Whether he ever intended to honor the bargain is a question the subsequent events answer plainly enough. The order went out across the empire. From every temple, every palace, every storehouse, gold and silver were stripped and sent to Cajamarca. The golden walls of the Coricancha were pulled down. The golden garden with its life-sized maize stalks, its golden llamas, its golden butterflies was dismantled and melted. Objects of extraordinary artistic and religious significance, crafted by generations of master goldsmiths, were reduced to ingots for easier transport and division among the conquerors. The Spanish set up forges in Cajamarca and worked day and night, melting down the treasures of a civilization into standardized bars of bullion that could be weighed, valued, and distributed according to rank. Indian smiths were forced to assist in the destruction of their own sacred art. The ransom took months to assemble. During this time, Atahualpa continued to govern what remained of his empire from captivity, issuing orders through messengers, managing the political complexities of a state that was still reeling from civil war. He also, according to the chroniclers, ordered the execution of his brother Huascar, who remained a prisoner of Atahualpa's generals in the south. The order was carried out. Huascar was killed, probably by drowning, removing the last alternative focus of legitimate Inca authority. Whether Atahualpa gave this order on his own initiative or was manipulated into it by the Spanish, who may have recognized the danger of a rival Inca claimant, is unclear. The result was the same. The Inca royal succession was reduced to a single man, and that man was a prisoner. The ransom was eventually assembled. The quantities were staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the total haul amounted to roughly 6 tons of gold and 12 tons of silver, worth, in contemporary terms, tens of millions of dollars. It was the largest ransom in the history of the world, before or since. Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. The reasons were pragmatic and transparent. Atahualpa, alive and free, was an existential threat to the Spanish position. He commanded the loyalty of millions. His army, though scattered by the Civil War and the shock of Cajamarca, was still vastly larger than any force the Spanish could field. Releasing him would be releasing the one man capable of organizing effective resistance. The ransom had been a tool for extracting wealth, not a genuine bargain. A trial was convened. The charges against Atahualpa were numerous, and by Spanish legal standards largely fabricated or irrelevant. He was accused of idolatry, of polygamy, of murdering his brother, of plotting to incite rebellion against the Spanish, of squandering the wealth of the empire. The trial was conducted in Spanish, a language Atahualpa did not speak, under legal codes he had never heard of, invoking a religion to which he had never subscribed. It was a legal performance designed to produce a predetermined verdict, and it achieved its goal with bureaucratic efficiency. Atahualpa was sentenced to death by burning. For the Inca, this was a horror beyond the simple terror of execution. The Inca believed that the preservation of the body after death was essential for the continuation of the soul. To be burned was to be annihilated not just in this life, but in the next. The mummies of the ancestors, carefully preserved and tended for generations, testified to the centrality of bodily integrity after death. Burning was not merely capital punishment. It was cosmic destruction. At the last moment, Fray Valverde offered Atahualpa a bargain. Accept baptism, convert to Christianity, and the sentence would be commuted from burning to the garrote, strangulation by an iron collar. The body would remain intact. Atahualpa accepted. He was baptized, given the Christian name Francisco in honor of Pizarro, and then strangled to death in the plaza of Cajamarca on July 26, 1533. He was approximately 30 years old. The Spanish accounts record that Atahualpa maintained his composure to the end. He did not beg. He did not weep. He sat in the chair to which he was bound and received the iron collar with the stillness that his rank and his culture demanded. The son of the sun died as he had lived, with the practiced impassivity of a man who had been trained from childhood to reveal nothing of what he felt. What he actually felt in those final moments as the cold metal tightened around his throat and the faces of his captors blurred and the thin mountain air refused to enter his lungs belongs to a privacy that no chronicle can breach. His death did not destroy the empire. Not immediately. The Inca state was vast, its administrative structures still partially functional, its population enormous, but the removal of the Sapa Inca from the center of the system was like removing the keystone from an arch. The structure did not collapse at once. It sagged, shifted, cracked, and then piece by piece fell inward on itself. Pizarro installed a puppet Inca, a young prince named Tupac Hualpa, who conveniently died within weeks, probably poisoned. He was replaced by Manco Inca, another son of Huayna Capac, who initially cooperated with the Spanish under the assumption that they would serve as useful allies in restoring order after the Civil War. Manco Inca entered Cusco with the Spanish in November 1533, nearly a year after Cajamarca, and for a brief, strange period, the Inca and Spanish administrations attempted to coexist. The arrangement was doomed from the start. The Spanish treated Manco Inca with increasing contempt. Pizarro's brothers, particularly Juan and Gonzalo, abused the puppet ruler openly, reportedly demanding his wives for their own use and subjecting him to humiliations that violated every principle of the respect owed to the Sapa Inca. For a society in which the ruler's dignity was cosmic law, these abuses were not merely personal insults. They were violations of the natural order that held the world together. In 1536, Manco Inca escaped from Spanish custody and launched a massive rebellion. He gathered an army estimated at over 100,000 warriors and besieged Cusco. For months, the Spanish garrison of roughly 200 men was surrounded and under constant attack. Inca warriors rained sling stones and fire arrows down on the city from the heights of Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress Pachacuti had built to protect Cusco. The irony was savage. The fortress designed to shield the Inca capital from its enemies was now being used by the Inca themselves in a desperate attempt to reclaim their city from invaders who had turned its own stones into their stronghold. The siege of Cusco was the closest the Inca came to reversing the conquest. At several points, the Spanish position appeared hopeless. The Inca captured Sacsayhuaman's outer defenses and poured fire into the city below. Juan Pizarro, Francisco's brother, was killed in the fighting to retake the fortress, struck in the head by a stone during a night assault on the walls. The battle for Sacsayhuaman was savage hand-to-hand fighting. The Inca and Spanish locked in combat on the terraces and walls that Inca engineers had built to be impregnable. When the Spanish finally retook the fortress, the Inca garrison fought until the last man. Chroniclers describe warriors throwing themselves from the walls rather than surrender, but the siege ultimately failed. The Inca could not sustain a prolonged siege because their army was composed of Mita laborers who needed to return home for the planting season. Agriculture could not be neglected indefinitely, not even for the liberation of the sacred capital. The very system that allowed the Inca to mobilize enormous armies also imposed a time limit on their operations that European-style professional armies did not face. Additionally, the Spanish were receiving reinforcements from Panama and the Caribbean, while the Inca forces were dwindling as communities calculated that cooperation with the invaders might prove more survivable than continued resistance. Manco Inca retreated into the mountains and eventually established a rump Inca state at Vilcabamba, deep in the cloud forests northeast of Cusco. There, in the green obscurity of a landscape so remote that the Spanish could not easily reach it, the last independent Inca state persisted for another 36 years. 4 successive rulers maintained the traditions, the ceremonies, and the claim to sovereignty of Tawantinsuyu from this jungle refuge. They raided Spanish outposts, they sheltered refugees, they kept the old religion alive when it was being systematically destroyed everywhere else. But Vilcabamba was a ghost of the empire, not its continuation. The roads were broken. The storehouses were empty or in Spanish hands. The Mita system, which had required the coordinated effort of 10 million people across a vast territory, could not function from a jungle encampment. The Quipuca Mayaks had no empire to count. The Chasqui had no messages to carry. The Seque lines radiating from Cusco still existed in the landscape, but the sacred sites along them were being demolished by Spanish priests who replaced huacas with crosses and converted temples into churches. The Coricancha itself was given to the Dominican order, who built their church of Santo Domingo directly on top of it, using the Inca walls as foundations. When earthquakes struck, as they periodically did, the Dominican masonry crumbled while the Inca stonework beneath it survived, a metaphor so precise that it hardly needs stating. The end of independent Inca rule came in 1572 when the Spanish viceroy Francisco de Toledo organized a military expedition into Vilcabamba. The last Sapa Inca, Tupac Amaru, was captured, brought to Cusco, and publicly beheaded in the Great Plaza. Tens of thousands of indigenous people, many of them weeping, watched from the hillsides and the edges of the square as the last son of the sun was executed on the stones his ancestors had laid. The chroniclers record that when the executioner raised the severed head, the crowd's wailing was so loud that it drowned out the proclamation the Spanish authorities were attempting to read. The sound echoed off the walls of the Coricancha, now Santo Domingo, off the precise ashlar masonry of buildings that Pachacuti had raised from the dust of an older Cusco, off the mountains that the Inca had believed were living gods watching over their children. The gods said nothing. The mountains stood, as mountains do, indifferent to the arrangements of the small, warm, temporary creatures moving across their surface. The empire of the 4 quarters was over. Tawantinsuyu, which had taken a century to build, and which had organized the lives of 10 million people across one of the most demanding landscapes on Earth, had been destroyed in 40 years by a combination of epidemic disease, internal civil war, technological asymmetry, and the particular genius of violence that the Spanish had refined across centuries of their own bloody history. But destruction is never total, however much the destroyers might wish it to be. The Inca did not vanish. They could not vanish. 10 million people do not simply cease to exist because their ruler has been killed and their temples converted into churches. What happened instead was something more complex, more painful, and in many ways more remarkable than either simple survival or simple destruction. The Inca world went underground. It bent. It adapted. It wore the face its conquerors demanded while keeping, in the quiet spaces of memory and practice, the things the conquerors could not reach. The decades following the fall of Vilcabamba were among the darkest in the history of the Andean peoples. The Spanish colonial system, which had initially attempted a kind of uneasy coexistence with indigenous structures, hardened into a regime of systematic extraction that would have made even the most demanding Sapa Inca pause. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists the labor of indigenous communities in exchange for their supposed Christianization and protection. In practice, it was forced labor with a theological veneer. Communities that had once owed their Maita service to the Inca state now owed it to individual Spaniards whose interest in their welfare extended precisely as far as their productivity. But it was the mines that consumed lives on a scale that defies comfortable contemplation. The Silver Mountain of Potosi, discovered in 1545 in what is now Bolivia, became the engine of the Spanish colonial economy and the tomb of countless indigenous workers. The mountain, called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill, contained the largest deposit of silver ore the world had ever seen. The Spanish organized its extraction using a version of the mit'a that bore the same name as the Inca institution, but shared none of its reciprocal obligations. Indigenous men were drafted from communities across the former empire, marched to Potosi, and sent into the mountain through tunnels that burrowed deep into the earth. They worked in conditions of almost unimaginable horror. The tunnels were narrow, dark, and poorly ventilated. The air was thick with rock dust that coated the lungs and produced a slow, suffocating death. Temperatures underground swung from freezing to furnace hot depending on depth. Cave-ins were common. Mercury, used in the amalgamation process to extract silver from ore, poisoned workers who handled it daily. Men entered the mines on Monday and did not emerge until Saturday, spending the entire week underground, sleeping in the tunnels, eating what they had carried in, breathing air that was slowly killing them. The scale of mortality at Potosi is disputed among historians, but even conservative estimates are staggering. Over the 3 centuries of colonial mining operations, millions of indigenous workers were conscripted for service at the mines. The death toll from mining accidents, mercury poisoning, silicosis, and the general attrition of working conditions that no human body was designed to endure ran into the hundreds of thousands at minimum. Some scholars have argued for figures much higher. The indigenous people of the Andes called Potosi the mountain that eats men, and the name was not metaphorical. The silver that flowed from Potosi financed the Spanish Empire, funded its wars in Europe, built its cathedrals, and paid its debts. It crossed the Atlantic in galleons and entered the bloodstream of the global economy. The coins minted from Potosi silver circulated in markets from London to Beijing. The modern world was built in part on silver pulled from Andean rock by Andean hands that would never hold a single coin of it. Meanwhile, the spiritual conquest proceeded alongside the material one. The Spanish colonial church undertook a systematic campaign to eradicate indigenous religious practice. The campaigns of extirpation, as they were formerly called, targeted huacas, mummies, and any manifestation of traditional worship with a thoroughness that reflected both genuine religious conviction and political calculation. Priests traveled through indigenous communities, destroying sacred objects, burning mummies, demolishing shrines, and punishing anyone caught practicing the old rites. The mummies of the former Sapa Incas, those carefully preserved ancestors who had continued to govern through their descendants, who had sat on their thrones and received offerings and spoken through the mouths of their living caretakers, were hunted down and burned. Most were found and destroyed. A few were hidden so successfully that they have never been recovered. Somewhere in the Andes, perhaps, the mummified remains of Pachacuti himself still rest in a cave or a sealed chamber, attended by no one, speaking to no one, waiting in the darkness of a world that no longer listens for the voices of its dead. The burning of the mummies was, for the indigenous peoples, an act of violence that transcended the physical. It was the murder of the already dead, the destruction of ancestors whose continued existence was woven into the fabric of social, economic, and spiritual life. The Panicas lost not just their revered forebears, but the political legitimacy and property rights that those forebears embodied. A dead Sapa Inca who still owned land, still commanded servants, still received tribute, was a living institution. To burn his body was to dissolve that institution, to erase a node in the network of obligations and relationships that held Andean society together. The Spanish understood this, at least partially, which is why they were so thorough, and yet the old beliefs did not die. They could not die because they were not merely beliefs. They were the landscape itself. The mountains were still there. The Apus still towered over every village, their peaks catching the first light of morning and the last light of evening, their glaciers feeding the rivers that watered the fields, their weather patterns determining whether a community ate or starved. You could burn a mummy. You could destroy a huaca. You could replace a sun temple with a church, but you could not demolish a mountain. You could not extirpate the snow, the wind, the earthquake, the thunderstorm. The sacred geography of the Andes was written in stone 12,000 feet high, and no campaign of spiritual conquest could rewrite it. What emerged was a religious synthesis that the Spanish authorities found deeply troubling and could never fully suppress. Indigenous communities adopted the external forms of Christianity with varying degrees of sincerity and adapted them to their own purposes. Catholic saints were mapped onto Andean deities. The Virgin Mary absorbed attributes of Pachamama, the Earth Mother. The cross was planted on mountaintops that had been sacred to the Apus since long before the Spanish arrived, and the indigenous worshippers who knelt before those crosses were praying to something older and deeper than the priests who installed them understood. Festival days in the Catholic calendar were aligned with the agricultural ceremonies that had governed Andean life for millennia. Corpus Christi in Cusco became a venue for the display of indigenous identity, with different communities processing through the streets carrying saints' images that were dressed in Inca-style textiles and adorned with symbols that spoke one language to Spanish observers and an entirely different one to indigenous participants. This was not passive syncretism, the mindless blending of two traditions by people too unsophisticated to distinguish them. It was strategic adaptation, a deliberate and often dangerous practice of encoding forbidden meanings within permitted forms. The anthropologist and chronicler who best captures this process is perhaps Guaman Poma de Ayala himself, the indigenous writer whose massive illustrated letter to the King of Spain, composed around 1615, documented both the glories of the Inca past and the horrors of the colonial present. His manuscript, which was lost for centuries before being discovered in the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen in 1908, is a remarkable act of cultural preservation disguised as a petition. It records Inca history, calendar systems, administrative practices, and daily life in text and drawings that constitute one of the most valuable primary sources for understanding the pre-conquest Andean world. It also documents with a fury barely contained by its diplomatic framing the abuses inflicted on indigenous people by Spanish colonial administrators, priests, and settlers. Guaman Poma's work reminds us that the colonial period was not a monolith of unresisted oppression. Indigenous communities pushed back in ways large and small, visible and invisible. They maintained hidden shrines in caves and on remote mountain slopes. They continued to make offerings to the Apus when no priest was watching. They preserved genealogies and historical traditions in oral form, passing them from generation to generation in Quechua, a language the Spanish administrators rarely bothered to learn well. They used the Spanish legal system itself as a tool of resistance, filing lawsuits, petitioning courts, appealing to distant authorities, and demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the colonizers' own institutions that the colonizers frequently underestimated. And periodically the resistance erupted into open rebellion. The colonial history of the Andes is punctuated by indigenous uprisings, some local and quickly suppressed, others vast enough to shake the foundations of Spanish rule. The greatest of these came in 1780, more than 2 centuries after the fall of Vilcabamba, and it bore a name that deliberately reached back across those centuries to claim the authority of the Inca past. José Gabriel Condorcanqui was a mestizo nobleman, a descendant of Tupac Amaru, the last Sapa Inca executed in 1572. He was educated, prosperous by local standards, and initially sought to address indigenous grievances through legal channels. He petitioned the colonial authorities for relief from the Mita mining drafts, the forced purchases of overpriced goods that corrupt officials imposed on indigenous communities, and the general weight of exploitation that bore down on the indigenous and mestizo population. His petitions were ignored, the legal channels were closed, and so in November 1780 he took the name of his ancestor. He became Tupac Amaru II, and he declared war on the Spanish colonial state. The rebellion spread with a speed that terrified the colonial authorities. Within weeks, large portions of the southern Peruvian highlands were in open revolt. Tupac Amaru II captured and publicly executed a Spanish provincial governor, Antonio de Arriaga, hanging him in the plaza of the town of Tungasuka in a deliberate echo of Spanish colonial justice turned back upon itself. Indigenous communities across the region rallied to his cause. The rebels defeated Spanish forces in several engagements, and for a brief, incandescent moment, it appeared that the colonial order might actually break. It did not. The Spanish mobilized a massive military response, bolstered by indigenous groups who had their own reasons for opposing Tupac Amaru's particular coalition. The rebellion was crushed. Tupac Amaru II was captured in April 1781 and brought to Cusco, where his execution was designed to be a spectacle of such overwhelming violence that no one would ever dare rebel again. The sentence was carried out on May 18, 1781, in the same great plaza where his ancestor had been beheaded 2 centuries earlier. Tupac Amaru was forced to watch the execution of his wife, Michaela Bastidas, his eldest son, his uncle, and several of his captains. They were killed by various means, hanging, garroting, and in the case of Bastidas, a combination of methods when the initial execution failed because the garrote could not close around her slender neck. Then it was Tupac Amaru's turn. The Spanish attempted to tear him apart by tying his limbs to 4 horses and driving them in opposite directions. The man's body would not separate. The horses strained. The ropes cut into his flesh. The crowd watched in horror. The body held. Finally, after what the witnesses described as an eternity of agonized struggle, the Spanish commander ordered Tupac Amaru beheaded. His body was then dismembered, and the parts distributed to different provinces of the former rebellion, displayed on pikes in public squares as a warning. The colonial authorities then enacted a series of laws designed to erase Inca identity from public life entirely. The use of Inca royal insignia was banned. The use of Inca royal insignia was banned. Inca-style clothing was prohibited. The reading of the royal commentaries of Garcilaso de la Vega, which had kept alive the memory of Inca glory for nearly 2 centuries, was forbidden. Paintings depicting Inca rulers were ordered destroyed. The Quechua language, spoken by millions, was targeted for suppression. Even the name Inca was banned from public use. The colonial state was attempting something that empires throughout history have attempted and never fully achieved: the erasure of a people's memory of themselves. The laws failed. As such, laws always fail because memory does not live in books or clothing or insignia alone. It lives in the way a grandmother tells a story to a child while spinning wool in the evening light. It lives in the songs sung during planting season, whose melodies carry words older than the colonial order and whose rhythms sync with the turning of the earth beneath the plow. It lives in the names given to mountains, to rivers, to fields, names in Quechua that encoded relationships between people and landscapes stretching back centuries before any Spaniard set foot on Andean soil. You can ban a garment. You cannot ban a mountain's name from the mouths of the people who live beneath it. The rebellion of Tupac Amaru II was crushed, but its aftershocks reverberated through the colonial world for decades. It contributed to the climate of instability that would eventually lead to the independence movements of the early 19th century. When Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín liberated the former Inca territories from Spanish rule in the 1820s, they did so using armies that included large numbers of indigenous and mestizo soldiers whose grievances had roots stretching back to the conquest itself. The new republics that emerged, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, took their places among the nations of the world, with borders that roughly, imperfectly, and often violently overlaid the old boundaries of Tawantinsuyu. But independence from Spain did not mean liberation for the indigenous peoples of the Andes. The new republican governments were controlled by Creole elites of European descent, whose attitudes toward the indigenous majority ranged from paternalistic concern to outright contempt. The hacienda system replaced the encomienda, concentrating land in the hands of a small number of wealthy families while the indigenous population provided the labor that made those estates profitable. The mita was officially abolished, but forced labor under other names persisted well into the 20th century. Indigenous communities lost land to expanding haciendas, mining operations, and government appropriation. Their languages were marginalized. Their cultural practices were dismissed as primitive. Their political participation was restricted by literacy requirements and property qualifications designed to exclude them from the franchise. The Inca past became, paradoxically, both a source of national pride and a justification for indigenous marginalization. The new nation celebrated the Inca Empire as a glorious chapter in their national heritage, erected monuments to Pachacuti and Atahualpa, and incorporated Inca symbols into their flags and coats of arms. But the living descendants of those Inca subjects, the Quechua and Aymara-speaking farmers and herders who still worked the same terraced fields and herded the same llamas on the same high pastures, were treated as obstacles to modernization rather than inheritors of a living tradition. The Inca were celebrated in the past tense and ignored in the present. This contradiction persists in complex and evolving forms to the present day. But the story of the Inca in the modern world is not only a story of marginalization and loss, it is also a story of resilience that borders on the miraculous. Quechua is still spoken by approximately 8 to 10 million people across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Argentina. It is the most widely spoken indigenous language family in the Americas. In Bolivia, it is an official state language. In Peru, it was recognized as an official language in 1975, though the gap between legal recognition and practical equality remains vast. Quechua is not a museum piece. It is a living language, spoken in homes and markets, used in music and poetry, and increasingly in digital media. Young Quechua speakers are creating content online, translating software interfaces, and asserting the relevance of their language in a globalized world that has long assumed its irrelevance. The agricultural practices developed by the Inca and their predecessors continue to feed Andean communities. Terraced farming, the cultivation of hundreds of potato varieties adapted to specific microclimates, the freeze-drying techniques that produce chuño, the herding of llamas and alpacas, all of these practices are still in daily use. More than that, they are increasingly recognized by agronomists and climate scientists as sophisticated adaptations to precisely the kinds of environmental challenges that climate change is now presenting to agricultural systems worldwide. The Inca approach to farming, which emphasized diversity over monoculture, resilience over maximum yield, and the careful matching of crop varieties to microenvironments, anticipated principles that modern sustainable agriculture is only now rediscovering. The potato itself, that humble tuber that sustained the Inca and their predecessors for millennia, became one of history's most consequential biological exports. Brought to Europe by the Spanish, it transformed the agriculture and demographics of the Old World. It fed the Industrial Revolution. It sustained populations through wars and famines. It became the staple food of Ireland, whose catastrophic dependence on a single variety led to the Great Famine of the 1840s, a disaster that ironically demonstrated exactly the danger of abandoning the Andean principle of cultivating diverse varieties adapted to local conditions. The International Potato Center in Lima maintains a collection of over 4,000 distinct potato varieties, most of them from the Andes, a genetic treasury whose value to global food security increases with every degree of planetary warming. The textile traditions of the Inca world survive in communities across the highlands, where weavers produce fabrics using techniques and patterns that connect directly to pre-Columbian traditions. Andean textiles were never merely functional objects. They were repositories of meaning, encoding information about the weaver's community, status, and identity in patterns whose complexity rivaled any writing system. The finest Inca cumbe cloth, woven from the hair of the vicuña, the wild relative of the alpaca, with thread counts that exceeded the finest European textiles of the same period, represented a pinnacle of artistic and technical achievement. The tradition did not die. It retreated into rural communities and domestic production, where it survived the colonial period and the Republican period and the 20th century's assaults of industrialization and globalization. Today, a growing market for hand-woven Andean textiles, driven partly by tourism and partly by a genuine appreciation of their artistry, is providing economic support for communities that have maintained these skills across 5 centuries of disruption. And then there are the ruins themselves. Machu Picchu, the estate that was probably built during Pachacuti's reign, abandoned during the chaos of the conquest, and then lost to the outside world for centuries beneath a thick shroud of cloud forest vegetation, was brought to international attention in 1911 by the American explorer Hiram Bingham. He was led there by local farmers who had known of its existence all along, a detail that encapsulates the relationship between indigenous knowledge and Western discovery with uncomfortable precision. The site became, over the course of the 20th century, one of the most famous archaeological destinations on Earth, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a symbol of Peru itself. Millions of visitors annually climb the steep trails to stand among the granite buildings and look out over the Urubamba Valley, where the river bends around the mountain in a curve that mirrors the curve of the terraces above, and they feel something. Some echo of the vision that drove the people who built this place to carry stones up a near vertical mountainside and fit them together with a precision that time and earthquake have not been able to undo. What they are feeling, whether they know it or not, is the presence of a civilization that refused to accept the limitations of its environment. Every terrace on that mountainside is an argument against impossibility. Every precisely fitted stone is a declaration that human will, organized and directed and sustained across generations, can reshape the earth itself. Machu Picchu is not a ruin. It is a statement still being made, still being heard, still capable of silencing the crowds that gather on its terraces every morning to watch the sun rise over the mountains exactly as it rose for the people who built this place 5.5 centuries ago. But Machu Picchu is only the most visible fragment of a much larger archaeological reality. The Capac Ñan, the Great Road Network, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, recognized across 6 South American nations as a cultural achievement of global significance. Archaeological work continues to reveal the scope and sophistication of Inca engineering, agriculture, and administration. New sites are still being discovered. New quipus are still being analyzed, their knotted strings slowly yielding their secrets to researchers who bring computational methods and fresh theoretical frameworks to artifacts that have resisted interpretation for centuries. The question of whether quipus encode narrative information, whether they constitute a form of writing that we have simply not learned to read, remains one of the most tantalizing open questions in the study of ancient civilizations. If the answer is yes, the implications would reshape our understanding not only of the Inca, but of the nature of literacy itself. The physical landscape of the Inca world endures because it was built to endure. Inca stonework, constructed without mortar by people without iron tools, has survived 5 centuries of earthquakes, colonial demolition, urban development, and neglect. In Cusco, the walls of Inca buildings still line the streets of the modern city, their precisely fitted blocks supporting Spanish colonial and modern construction that sits on top of them like a palimpsest of conquest. Tourists walking through the narrow streets run their fingers along the smooth stone surfaces and feel the slight concavity where each block was shaped to fit its neighbor, a tactile record of individual human hands working with patience and precision that defies casual comprehension. The 12-angled stone, a single block in an Inca wall in central Cusco that was cut to fit perfectly against 12 neighboring stones in 12 different planes, has become a tourist attraction in its own right, a demonstration of engineering virtuosity so excessive that it reads as a deliberate boast. We can do this, the stone says. We can make this landscape obey us. We can fit the irregular pieces of the world together so precisely that time itself cannot find the seams. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of all. Not the gold, which was melted, not the roads, which were broken, not the storehouses, which were emptied, not even the administrative genius, which was dismantled. The deepest legacy is the stone itself and what it represents. The conviction that a people living in one of the most hostile environments on the planet could look at that environment and say, this is not a barrier, this is a material. We will shape it. We will organize it. We will make it serve a vision so ambitious that the people who come after us, even the ones who destroy us, will stand before what we built and fall silent. The Inca were not perfect. No civilization is. The empire they built was maintained through coercion as well as reciprocity, through forced resettlement as well as generous redistribution, through the suppression of local identities as well as the incorporation of local traditions. The Mita, for all its reciprocal framing, was compulsory labor extracted from communities that had not chosen to be conquered. The Mutma resettlement policy shattered families and severed peoples from the landscapes that gave their lives meaning. The execution of resistors, the trophy skulls, the flayed skins, these were not aberrations of the system, they were instruments of it. The Inca achieved what they achieved in part because they were willing to be ruthless. And any honest accounting of their civilization must hold the genius and the cruelty in the same hand, feeling the weight of both. But the same is true of every empire that has ever existed, and what distinguishes the Inca is not their perfection, but their originality. They solved the problem of governing a vast, diverse, geographically impossible territory without the two tools that every other major civilization considered indispensable: writing and money. They did it with string and memory, with roads and runners, with labor and reciprocity, with a system so internally consistent and so perfectly adapted to its environment that it functioned with extraordinary efficiency for nearly a century before the collision with Europe introduced variables that no system, however elegant, could have anticipated. The question that haunts the story of the Inca is the question that haunts all stories of civilizations destroyed by external forces. What would have happened if the collision had not occurred? What would Tawantinsuyu have become if smallpox had never crossed the Atlantic? If Pizarro had never drawn his line in the sand? If the golden garden of the Coricancha had never been fed to Spanish forges? Would the empire have continued to expand? Would it have fractured along the fault lines that the Civil War revealed, splitting into northern and southern kingdoms that might have evolved independently? Would the Quipu have developed into a full writing system? Would the principles of reciprocity and redistribution have adapted to the pressures of a growing population and a finite territory? Would the Inca have reached the Pacific Islands that Tupac Inca Yupanqui may or may not have visited? And if so, what would that contact have produced? These questions have no answers. They belong to a history that was never allowed to happen, a future that was stolen on a November afternoon in Cajamarca when a priest dropped a book and a cannon fired and the world turned for the last time. What we have instead is what survived, and what survived is more than anyone had a right to expect. The story of the Inca does not end with the execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572, or with the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780, or with the independence of Peru in 1824. It does not end at all. It continues in the Quechua words spoken by a mother to her child in a village above Cusco. It continues in the hands of a weaver producing patterns whose grammar predates the Spanish language by centuries. It continues in the farmer who plants 40 varieties of potato on a single hillside, each variety chosen for its specific niche in the vertical ecology, each one a living link to the agricultural science of a people who fed 10 million souls without a single written manual. It continues in the sound of a charango playing a melody in a minor key that carries, in its intervals and its rhythms, something older than the instrument itself, something that remembers a time when the roads were whole, and the runners were swift, and the storehouses were full, and the son of the sun sat on his golden throne in the navel of the world. The stars above Cusco still burn with the same fierce clarity they showed to Pachacuti when he looked up and saw a blueprint for a city shaped like a puma. The dark constellations are still there, the llama and the fox and the serpent picked out in shadow against the luminous river of the Milky Way. The mountains still stand. The apas still catch the first light and the last, still send their glacial waters down through valleys where people still farm the terraces their ancestors built. The earth still shakes. The stones still hold. And somewhere beneath those stones, beneath the colonial churches and the modern concrete and the tourist shops and the layers of 5 centuries of change, the foundations that Pachacuti laid are still bearing weight. still fitted together with joints so tight that a knife blade cannot enter, still standing after every earthquake, every conquest, every attempt at erasure, still holding up whatever the world places upon them. But to understand the full measure of what those foundations once supported, we must return to the living empire. We must go back to a time when the stones were new, and the mortar of human organization that held Tawantinsuyu together was still wet, still being shaped by the hands of administrators, priests, engineers, and ordinary people whose daily lives were governed by a system unlike anything else the world has ever produced. We have spoken of the roads and the runners, the storehouses and the armies, the conquests and the constructions, but an empire is not its infrastructure. An empire is its people, and the Inca system reached into the lives of those people with a thoroughness that no other pre-modern state achieved. To be a subject of Tawantinsuyu was to have every significant aspect of your existence, your labor, your marriage, your clothing, your diet, your movement, your worship, organized and accounted for by the state. This was not totalitarianism in the modern sense, a word freighted with 20th century horrors that do not map cleanly onto the Inca context. It was something older and stranger, a system that understood itself not as oppression, but as order, the maintenance of the cosmic balance that kept the world from flying apart. The foundation of this order was the census. The Inca counted everything. They counted people, llamas, storehouses, fields, bridges, weapons, textiles, and sacks of grain. They counted births and deaths, marriages and migrations, labor contributions and tribute payments. They counted with a precision that astonished the Spanish, who had nothing comparable in their own colonial administration for decades after the conquest. The Quipucamayaks, the keepers of the knotted strings, maintained records of such detail that a provincial administrator could report to Cusco exactly how many able-bodied men between the ages of 25 and 50 lived in a given district, how many of them had fulfilled their Mida obligation that year, how many llamas their community possessed, and how much maize their fields had produced at the last harvest. The population was organized into a decimal administrative system that imposed mathematical order on the organic complexity of Andean society. At the base was the household. 10 households formed a chunca, overseen by a chunca Kamayok. 5 chuncas, or 50 households, were overseen by a pichka chunca Kamayok. 2 of these units formed a pachaca, a group of 100 households, with its own administrator. 10 pachacas formed a waranka, a unit of 1,000 households, and 10 warancas formed a hunu, a unit of 10,000 households, overseen by a hunu curaka who answered directly to the provincial governor, who answered in turn to the lord of one of the empire's 4 quarters, the suyus, who answered to the Sapa Inca himself. This hierarchy was not merely administrative, it was the skeleton of the body politic. Every person in the empire existed within this structure, located precisely within the decimal grid, their obligations defined, their labor accounted for, their place in the cosmic order fixed as surely as the position of a stone in an Inca wall. The system was designed to be legible from the top. The Sapa Inca, sitting in Cusco with his Quipucamayaks arrayed before him, could in theory know the productive capacity, the military potential, and the demographic profile of every corner of his empire. In practice, of course, the system was imperfect. Local administrators falsified reports. Communities hid resources. The information that traveled up the hierarchy was filtered through layers of human interest and human error. But the ambition of the system, its sheer conceptual reach, was unparalleled. Age was the primary determinant of obligation. The Inca divided the human lifespan into approximately 12 categories, each with its associated responsibilities and privileges. Children progressed through stages defined by their growing capacity for useful labor. A boy of 9 might be assigned to trap birds whose feathers were collected for ceremonial use. A girl of the same age might be set to gathering flowers for dye making. Adolescents graduated to herding, farming, and textile production. Adults in their prime, roughly 25 to 50, bore the full weight of mita service. The elderly were exempted from heavy labor but were expected to contribute light tasks, braiding rope, minding children, and most importantly, teaching, maintaining the oral traditions that preserved community identity and practical knowledge across generations. Women's labor was as essential to the state as men's, though it was organized differently. The primary obligation of women to the Inca state was textile production. Cloth, in the Andean world, was the most valued of all commodities, more precious than gold, more significant than food. Textiles marked social status more precisely than any other material object. The quality of thread, the complexity of pattern, the fineness of weave, all communicated instantly and unmistakably where the wearer stood in the social hierarchy. The coarsest cloth, Ahuasca, was for daily domestic use, finer cloth was for provincial elites and state distribution, and the finest of all, cumbi, woven from vicuña hair with thread counts that could exceed 300 per inch, was reserved for the Sapa Inca, for offerings to the gods and for the most honored recipients of royal generosity. The state organized textile production through a remarkable institution called the Acalawasi, the House of the Chosen Women. In every provincial capital, and most prominently in Cusco itself, the Inca maintained compounds where selected young women, the Acalas, lived and worked under strict supervision. The Acalas were chosen from across the empire, selected for their beauty, their skill, or their high birth. They were taken from their families, often around the age of 10, and brought to the Acalawasi, where they were trained in weaving, brewing chicha, and performing religious ceremonies. Some became mamaconas, priestesses who served the sun god Inti for the rest of their lives. Others were given as secondary wives to men the Sapa Inca wished to honor or bind to his service, their bodies and their labor deployed as instruments of statecraft. The Acalawasi has been compared with varying degrees of accuracy to both convents and harems. Neither comparison is adequate. The institution was sui generis, a product of the specific Andean intersection of textile economics, state religion, and gender politics that has no precise equivalent in any other civilization. What is clear is that the Acalas occupied a position of enormous symbolic importance and deeply constrained personal autonomy. They were among the most skilled artisans in the empire, producing textiles of breathtaking beauty and technical sophistication. They were also, in the most literal sense, property of the state, their lives directed by an authority they had not chosen and could not refuse. The textiles they produced served functions that went far beyond clothing. Cloth was the medium of diplomacy, the currency of alliance, and the language of sacrifice. When the Sapa Inca wished to honor a conquered lord, he draped cumbi cloth around the man's shoulders. When the state needed to seal an agreement, textiles were exchanged. When the gods demanded appeasement, the finest textiles were burned as offerings, their destruction a measure of the offering's value. On the most solemn occasions, the capacocha ceremonies, selected children were dressed in the finest textiles the empire could produce and sent to mountain summits to be sacrificed. The capacocha demands a moment of unflinching attention because it reveals, perhaps more clearly than any other practice, both the depth of Inca religious conviction and the human cost of the cosmological system that sustained the empire. The capacocha was a state-sponsored sacrifice of children, performed at moments of supreme importance. The death of a Sapa Inca, a major military victory, a catastrophic natural disaster, or the installation of a new ruler. Children were selected from across the empire, chosen for their physical perfection, meaning the absence of any blemish, scar, or irregularity. They were brought to Cusco, where they participated in elaborate ceremonies. They were feasted, honored, and in the theological understanding of the Inca, elevated to a status approaching divinity. Then they were sent to the highest mountain summits in the empire, accompanied by attendants and laden with offerings of gold, silver, textiles, and ceramic vessels. And there, in the thin air above the clouds, they were killed. The methods varied. Some were strangled, some were struck on the head, some, as the remarkably preserved frozen mummies discovered at high-altitude sites in recent decades have revealed, were given quantities of chicha and coca sufficient to render them unconscious before they died of exposure in the freezing temperatures. The mummy known as the Maiden of Lulailaco, discovered on a summit in Argentina at over 6,700 meters above sea level, the highest archaeological site ever found, was a girl of approximately 15 who appears to have been heavily sedated before being left to freeze. Her body, preserved by centuries of ice, retains the appearance of sleep. Her hair is still braided. Her face is still composed. The textiles wrapped around her are still vibrant with color. She has been dead for 500 years, and she looks like she might wake up. The capacocha was not understood by the Inca as murder. It was understood as the highest possible honor, the transformation of a mortal child into a being of cosmic significance, an intermediary between the human world and the divine, a permanent offering to the Apis whose goodwill sustained the empire. The parents of selected children reportedly felt pride as well as grief, though one wonders how much of that reported pride was genuine, and how much was the required performance of subjects in a system that did not tolerate dissent. The children themselves, especially those old enough to understand what was happening, occupy a space in the historical record that is almost unbearable to contemplate. They were fed well. They were dressed beautifully. They were told they were becoming divine. And then they were taken to the top of the world and killed. Modern sensibility recoils from the capacocha, and it should. But the recoil must be accompanied by the recognition that the practice was embedded in a coherent cosmological framework that made it not merely explicable, but necessary. The Inca universe was one of reciprocal obligation at every level, from the household to the cosmos. The Apus gave water, fertility, and protection. The humans gave labor, reverence, and sacrifice. The balance had to be maintained. When the stakes were highest, when the death of a ruler threatened to unravel the cosmic order, or when a catastrophe suggested that the gods were displeased, the offering had to be proportional to the crisis. And the most valuable thing the Inca could offer was not gold or cloth or llamas. It was the thing they valued most, a perfect human life, given willingly, dressed in the finest products of human skill, placed at the summit of the most sacred geography on earth, as close to the sun as human feet could climb. This is not a defense of child sacrifice. It is an insistence that we understand it on its own terms before we judge it on ours, because without that understanding, the Inca become merely exotic barbarians rather than what they actually were. A people whose moral universe operated on principles fundamentally different from our own but no less internally coherent, and whose practices, however horrifying to modern eyes, were expressions of a worldview in which the boundary between the sacred and the political, between the human and the divine, between the living and the dead, simply did not exist in the way we assume it must. From the heights of sacrifice, let us descend to the daily texture of imperial life, because the genius of the Inca system lay not in its grand gestures, but in its management of the mundane. Food distribution was centrally managed to a degree that has few parallels outside of modern planned economies. The state maintained a network of storehouses called colcas, distributed along the road network and in every major settlement. These were not simple barns. They were carefully engineered storage facilities, typically circular or rectangular stone buildings positioned on hillsides above towns where air circulation was optimal and moisture minimal. The goods stored in them, dried potatoes, freeze-dried meat, maize, quinoa, dried fish, textiles, sandals, weapons, raw materials for craft production, were maintained in quantities sufficient to sustain the local population through years of crop failure and to supply armies on the march. The chronicler Chiesa de Leon reported that the storehouses he saw still contained enough food to feed an army for years, even after the disruption of the conquest had interrupted the system of replenishment. The administration of these storehouses was meticulous. Quipucameox maintained inventories of every item entering and leaving each colca. State officials were responsible for ensuring that stocks were rotated, that perishable goods were consumed before they spoiled, and that reserves were adequate to meet anticipated demand. The system functioned as a combination of social insurance, military logistics, and economic redistribution. In a good year, surplus production flowed into the storehouses. In a bad year, the storehouses fed the people, The state mediated between abundance and scarcity, smoothing the brutal fluctuations that highland agriculture, with its vulnerability to frost, drought, and flood, imposed on communities living at the edge of viability. Markets, in the European or Mesoamerican sense, did not exist in the Inca Empire. This is one of the most remarkable facts about Tawantinsuyu, and one of the most difficult for people educated in market economies to fully absorb. There was no money. There were no shops. There was no system of private exchange in which individuals bought and sold goods for profit. The state produced, collected, stored, and distributed. Individuals and communities exchanged goods and services through networks of reciprocal obligation that operated outside any market framework. You did not buy a pot from a potter. Your community's obligation to the potter's community was defined by the Elu system and the administrative hierarchy above it. You did not sell your surplus maize. You contributed it to the community stores or the state stores, and you drew from those stores when you needed something your own labor could not produce. This was not, strictly speaking, communism, though the comparison was drawn frequently by 20th century writers with ideological interests in either praising or condemning the Inca system. The Inca state was profoundly hierarchical. The Sapa Inca and the Cusco nobility lived in material luxury that was utterly beyond the reach of ordinary subjects. The redistribution of goods flowed upward as well as downward, concentrating wealth at the top while dispersing survival at the bottom. But the absence of a market economy meant that the mechanisms of inequality were different from those in market societies. You could not accumulate private wealth through trade. You could not become rich by buying low and selling high. Status and material comfort were functions of your position in the administrative hierarchy and your relationship to the Sapa Inca. Mobility was possible. A talented military commander or a gifted artisan could rise, but it was mobility within a fixed structure, not the fluid, open-ended mobility that market economies theoretically permit. The implications of this marketless economy for daily experience were profound. There was no anxiety about prices. There was no competition for customers. There was no possibility of individual commercial failure. There was also no individual commercial freedom. You produced what the state told you to produce. You worked where the state told you to work. You wore the clothing appropriate to your station and your province, and that clothing was prescribed by law. Different provinces had different required hairstyles, different hat shapes, different ear ornaments. A person's geographic and ethnic origin was visible at a glance, encoded in their appearance as precisely as data on a quipu. You could not pretend to be from somewhere else. You could not dress above your station. The system that guaranteed your survival also defined your identity, and it did so with the same precision it brought to counting llamas and stacking storehouses. Justice in the Inca Empire reflected this comprehensive integration of the individual into the state. The legal system recognized different categories of offense and applied different penalties depending on the social status of the offender and the nature of the crime. Common subjects were punished for theft, laziness, and failure to fulfill their mita obligations. Penalties ranged from public censure for minor offenses to execution for serious ones. Nobles were held to a higher standard and punished more severely for the same offenses, on the principle that those who had been given more by the state owed more in return. The death penalty was applied for murder, theft from the state, adultery involving a married woman, and blasphemy against the sun. Execution methods included stoning, hanging, and being thrown from a cliff. Prisons in the European sense did not exist. You were punished, and it was done. Or you were dead, and it was done. The system did not warehouse its problems, it resolved them. The most feared punishment was not death, but something worse than death for a people whose identity was inseparable from their community. Exile. To be expelled from your elu, to be severed from the network of reciprocal obligations that gave your life meaning and guaranteed your survival, was to become a non-person. You had no community to plow your field, no storehouse to draw from in times of need, no kin to mourn you when you died. You were socially annihilated. The threat of this annihilation was, for most people, sufficient to ensure compliance with a system that, whatever its limitations, provided a safety net of remarkable comprehensiveness in exchange for the freedom it demanded. The rhythm of the imperial year was punctuated by festivals of such scale and elaboration that the chronicles describing them read like dispatches from another planet. The Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, held at the June solstice, was the most important ceremonial event in the Inca calendar. For 9 days, Cusco became the stage for celebrations that drew participants from across the empire. The mummies of former Sapa Incas were brought out from their palaces and arranged in the Great Plaza, seated on their thrones in order of precedence, attended by their living descendants who spoke for them and offered them food and chicha. The reigning Sapa Inca presided from his own throne, surrounded by the living and the dead rulers of Tawantinsuyu, a physical manifestation of the continuity of power that linked the present to the mythic past. The ceremonies began before dawn. At the first appearance of the sun over the eastern mountains, the Sapa Inca raised a golden cup of chicha to the sky and poured a libation on the ground, greeting his divine father and asking for his continued blessing. Fires that had been extinguished throughout the city were relit from a single sacred flame kindled by focusing the sun's rays through a concave golden mirror. This new fire was distributed to every temple and household in Cusco, symbolizing the renewal of the cosmic cycle. Then the feasting began. Vast quantities of chicha were consumed. Music filled the plaza, drums and flutes, and the haunting tones of the pututo, a trumpet made from a conch shell, whose sound carried across the valley like the voice of the mountains themselves. Dances continued for days, performed by groups representing different regions of the empire, each in their distinctive provincial dress, each performing choreography that told the story of their people's incorporation into Tawantinsuyu. The Inti Raymi was simultaneously a religious ceremony, a political demonstration, and an act of cosmic maintenance. By bringing the empire together in Cusco, by feeding and clothing and entertaining its representatives, by displaying the continuity of rule from the first Inca to the present, the festival reinforced every bond that held the state together. It was reciprocity made spectacle. The Sapa Inca gave lavishly and publicly. The provinces received gratefully and publicly. The dead rulers watched, lending their accumulated authority to the proceedings. The sun shone, proving that the cosmic order was intact. And for 9 days, the extraordinary, impossible, audacious project that was Tawantinsuyu made perfect sense. The other great festivals followed their own rhythms, each tied to the agricultural calendar and to specific moments in the relationship between humans and the divine. The Capac Raymi at the December solstice celebrated the initiation of young noblemen into adulthood through a rigorous series of physical ordeals, fasting, running, and combat that tested their fitness to join the ruling class. The Amare in May marked the maize harvest with ceremonies of thanksgiving and redistribution. The Situa in September was a ritual of purification in which illness and evil were symbolically driven from Cusco by runners who carried the contamination to the rivers, which bore it away to the sea and beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. Each festival required enormous logistical coordination. Food and chicha had to be prepared in quantities sufficient for thousands of participants. Textiles had to be woven for distribution. Ceremonial objects had to be maintained and transported. The mummies had to be dressed, carried, and attended. The dances had to be rehearsed. The astronomical observations that determined the exact dates had to be precise because the festivals were timed to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of specific star clusters, and to begin a day early or a day late was not merely an error, but a disruption of the cosmic order. The astronomical knowledge of the Inca was sophisticated and practical. The Coricancha served as an observatory as well as a temple. Pillars erected on the skyline around Cusco marked the positions of the sun at key points in the agricultural and ceremonial calendar. When the setting sun aligned with a specific pillar, it was time to plant. When it aligned with another, it was time to harvest. The system was visible to the entire population of the valley, a public clock written in stone and sunlight that synchronized communal activity with celestial rhythm. Additional observations tracked the movements of the moon, the Pleiades star cluster, which was critical for calibrating the agricultural year, and the dark cloud constellations of the Milky Way. This was not abstract astronomy. It was applied cosmology, knowledge put to work in the service of feeding 10 million people and maintaining the ideological framework that justified the authority of the state. Every astronomical observation was simultaneously a political act, because the ability to predict the movements of the heavens demonstrated the Sapa Inca's privileged relationship with the divine forces that governed them. The sun obeyed the calendar that the Sapa Inca's priests maintained. The rains came when the ceremonies demanded. The crops grew because the cosmic order was preserved. When something went wrong, when frost killed the potatoes or drought shriveled the maize, the explanation was not natural variation, but spiritual imbalance, a failure of reciprocity, a neglected huaca, an insufficient offering. The solution was always more ceremony, more sacrifice, more rigorous attention to the obligations that connected the human world to the divine one. It was a closed system, beautiful in its internal logic, devastating in its fragility. As long as the harvest came and the storehouses filled and the armies won, and the Sapa Inca sat on his golden throne dispensing generosity with divine assurance, the system worked. It worked brilliantly. It fed more people across more difficult terrain with more consistent results than any other political system in the pre-Columbian Americas. But it depended absolutely and without alternative on the unbroken chain of authority that connected the Sapa Inca to the sun to the cosmos, and the cosmos to the earth. Break that chain, and the entire architecture of meaning collapsed. Not gradually, not partially, but totally, because there was no conceptual fallback, no secular framework of governance that could operate independently of the sacred one. This is what the Spanish destroyed at Cajamarca. Not just a ruler, not just an army, a universe. The magnitude of that destruction becomes most visible not in the grand narrative of conquest and resistance, but in the small details of what was lost. Consider the Inca surgeons who performed successful trepanation, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure from head wounds, with survival rates that modern studies of archaeological skulls suggest exceeded 50%, a remarkable figure for any pre-modern surgical practice. Consider the engineers who built earthquake-resistant structures without mathematical notation, relying instead on an empirical understanding of stone and force that was transmitted through generations of hands-on apprenticeship. Consider the agronomists who developed over 3,000 varieties of potato, each adapted to a specific microclimate, each carrying in its genetic code the accumulated agricultural wisdom of centuries of careful selection and crossbreeding. Consider the weavers who produced textiles with thread counts exceeding anything in contemporary Europe using backstrap looms and spindles that could fit in a single hand. Consider the metallurgists who developed techniques for alloying copper with tin to produce bronze, and who worked gold and silver with methods including depletion gilding and lost wax casting that produced objects of such technical refinement that modern jewelers study them with professional respect. Each of these knowledge traditions represented centuries of accumulated expertise, transmitted not through written manuals, but through apprenticeship, through the patient transfer of skill from hand to hand, from generation to generation, embedded in practice rather than text. When the Spanish colonial system dismantled the institutions that sustained these traditions, when the Acalawasi were closed and the Quipucamayaks were rendered obsolete and the master builders were set to constructing churches instead of temples, knowledge did not merely cease to be recorded, it ceased to be practiced. And knowledge that ceases to be practiced begins immediately to die. Some of it was saved. The Spanish themselves, paradoxically, preserved fragments of what they were destroying. The chroniclers who recorded Inca oral history, however imperfectly, however filtered through European assumptions and Christian theology, captured something that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Cieza de Leon's careful descriptions of Inca roads, storehouses, and administrative practices, Betanzos's intimate account of Inca mythology and court life, drawn from his wife's first-hand knowledge. Garcilaso de la Vega's lyrical reconstruction of the world his mother remembered, Guaman Poma's furious, illustrated encyclopedia of Andean life before and after the conquest. These texts are imperfect vessels cracked and stained by the circumstances of their creation, but they carry water that would otherwise have been spilled irretrievably on the ground. Other knowledge survived through practice, passed down in communities that continued to farm, weave, build, and heal using methods their ancestors had developed. The potato farmers of the High Puna did not need a written manual to know which varieties thrived at which altitude, which soils produced the best yield, which combinations of frost and sun produced the finest chuño. They knew because their mothers had known, and their mothers' mothers, in an unbroken chain of practical wisdom that stretched back to a time before the Inca themselves had risen from the Cusco Valley. The weavers of Chinchero and Tequili did not need a textile archive to reproduce patterns that encoded community identity and cosmological meaning. The patterns lived in their fingers, in the muscle memory of hands that had been learning since childhood, guided by hands that had learned the same way a generation before. But much was lost. The Quipu system, whatever its full capabilities, was rendered functionally extinct within decades of the conquest. The last Quipu Kamayaks who understood the full complexity of the recording system died without passing their knowledge to successors who could use it, because the administrative system that gave Quipas their purpose no longer existed. The astronomical observations that had synchronized imperial life with celestial rhythms continued to inform agricultural practice at the local level, but lost their institutional framework. The network of trained observers, the Coricancha Observatory, the pillar system on the Cusco skyline that had made them instruments of state power. The surgical knowledge that had produced successful trepanations was gradually displaced by European medical practices that were in many respects less effective. The engineering expertise that had built Sacsayhuaman and the Capacñan persisted in diminished form in communities that continued to build in stone, but the capacity to mobilize thousands of workers for a single monumental project, the institutional knowledge of how to quarry, transport, and fit stones weighing hundreds of tons was lost with the Midas system that had made such projects possible. The deepest loss, and the one most difficult to quantify, was epistemological. The Inca way of knowing the world, of organizing information, of recording and transmitting knowledge, was fundamentally different from the European way. And the collision between the two was not a meeting of equals in which both systems were enriched. It was a replacement in which one system was imposed and the other suppressed. The Inca had demonstrated that a complex civilization could function, and function brilliantly without alphabetic writing and market exchange. This demonstration was not merely practically significant, it was philosophically revolutionary. It proved that the European model of civilization, text-based, market-driven, currency-mediated, was not the only possible model. That other architectures of knowledge and social organization could produce results of comparable sophistication. The conquest erased this proof, or rather, it buried it beneath centuries of colonial ideology that dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive, indigenous social organization as savage, and indigenous religion as diabolical. The idea that the Inca might have had something to teach the Europeans, rather than simply something to surrender to them, was literally unthinkable within the framework of colonial thought. And so the most radical implication of the Inca achievement, that civilization itself, might take forms that the Western tradition could not recognize because it lacked the categories to perceive them, was lost along with the Golden Garden and the knotted strings and the runners on the road. The recovery of that implication is one of the great intellectual projects of the modern study of the Inca. Archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, linguists, and increasingly indigenous scholars working within and across Western academic traditions are reconstructing not just the facts of Inca civilization, but its underlying logic, the principles that made it work, the assumptions about the world that made those principles seem natural and necessary. This work is difficult because it requires thinking outside categories that Western education has made second nature. The question is not simply how did the Inca administer their empire without writing? It is, what does it mean that they could, and what does our surprise at this tell us about the limitations of our own assumptions? The answer, still emerging, still incomplete, is that human beings are capable of organizing knowledge, coordinating collective action, and creating lasting civilizations in ways that the Western tradition, with its particular history and its particular tools, has systematically underestimated. The Inca are not an anomaly, they are evidence. Evidence that the human capacity for social complexity is wider, deeper, and more inventive than any single tradition can encompass. But we have wandered far from the living empire into the aftermath of its destruction and the slow archaeology of its meaning. Let us return one final time to Tawantinsuyu as it was to the territory itself, to the four quarters that gave the empire its name, and to the experience of moving through that territory as the Inca shaped it. Tawantinsuyu meant the four parts together, and the empire was divided into four suyus radiating outward from Cusco like the quadrants of a compass. Chinchaysuyu, the northwestern quarter, encompassed the coastal and highland regions stretching toward modern Ecuador and Colombia. Antisuyu, the northeastern quarter, included the eastern slopes of the Andes descending toward the Amazon basin, the wild frontier that the Inca could influence but never fully control. Calasuyu, the southeastern quarter, was the largest, stretching south through the high altiplano around Lake Titicaca and deep into modern Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And Kuntisuyu, the southwestern quarter, encompassed the arid coastal regions of southern Peru. Each suyu had its own character, its own challenges, its own relationship to the center. Chinchaysuyu was the most recently conquered and the most turbulent, its northern reaches still being integrated when the empire fell. Antisuyu was the frontier of the unknown, where the ordered world of the Inca gave way to the green chaos of the jungle. Calasuyu was the heartland of the Aymara-speaking peoples, whose own imperial traditions predating the Inca gave them a sense of cultural pride that made them both valuable subjects and potential rebels. Kuntisuyu was the driest and most sparsely populated quarter, its coastal deserts home to fishing communities and the remnants of earlier civilizations whose ruins reminded every traveler that empires were mortal. To travel the Capocñan from one end of the empire to the other was to experience the full range of environments that the planet can produce within a single political entity. Begin at the northern frontier, in the wet highlands of southern Colombia, where the air is thick with moisture and the hillsides are draped in cloud forest, orchids clinging to every trunk, hummingbirds hovering at every blossom, the sound of water everywhere, dripping, running, falling. The road descends through the highlands of Ecuador, past the volcanic peaks of Cotopaxi and Chimborazo, their snow-capped summits visible for 100 kilometers on clear days, their eruptions a periodic reminder of the geological violence that shaped this landscape. Past Tumibamba, where Huayna Capac held his northern court, its temples and palaces now mostly quarried away by Spanish colonists who used the dressed stone for their own buildings. South through the highlands the road runs, crossing passes above 4,000 meters where the air burns cold in the lungs and the sky is so close and so dark a blue that it seems almost black. Down into green valleys where maize grows in terraced fields that step down the hillsides like staircases built for giants. Past the great tambo complexes where weary travelers rested and state business was conducted, where Quipucamayaks sat cross-legged in shaded courtyards, their fingers moving among the colored strings with the fluency of musicians playing instruments of extraordinary complexity. Past the kolkas on the hillsides above every settlement, their circular stone walls casting short shadows in the midday sun, their contents the physical manifestation of the state's promise, you will not starve. We have counted. We have stored. We have provided. Into the Cusco Valley at last, where the road widens and straightens and the city appears below, spread along the valley floor between its two channeled rivers, the golden roof of the Coricancha catching the afternoon light and throwing it back at the sky like a challenge. The walls of Sacsayhuaman crown the hill above, their zigzag teeth biting into the skyline. The great plaza opens before you, swept clean, bordered by the finest masonry in the Americas, alive with the movement of people from every corner of the empire, their provincial dress making the plaza a living map of Tawantinsuyu's diversity. A man from the northern coast in his white cotton tunic and distinctive head wrap stands beside a woman from the Altiplano in her heavy wool skirt and bright shawl, her bowler-like hat marking her origin as precisely as a postal code. A delegation from the jungle fringe, dark-skinned and lightly dressed, carries bundles of feathers and medicinal plants. A troop of soldiers passes in formation, their quilted armor and bronze-tipped weapons gleaming, their disciplined, silent testimony to the military machine that built this world. Continue south. The road climbs out of the Cusco Valley and onto the Altiplano, the high plateau that stretches south toward Lake Titicaca, vast and treeless and exposed to winds that cut through clothing like blades of ice. The light here is different, harsher, more absolute. Shadows are shorter and darker, colors are more vivid because the thinner atmosphere filters less light. The grass on the puna is golden brown, cropped short by herds of llamas and alpacas that move across the landscape in loose formations, their long necks swaying, their padded feet leaving barely a mark on the thin soil. Vicuñas, the wild cousins of the alpaca, stand on distant ridges watching the road with the alertness of animals that have learned across millennia that anything moving on two legs is potentially dangerous. They are protected by Inca law, these vicuñas. Only the Sapa Inca may wear their wool. Poaching is punishable by death. The law will outlast the empire, in principle, if not in enforcement, preserved in the collective memory of communities who will continue to regard the vicuña with something approaching reverence long after the Spanish have made the laws and burned the quipus that recorded them. Lake Titicaca appears on the horizon like a hallucination, an impossible sheet of dark blue water at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters, the highest navigable lake in the world. Its surface stretches so far that the far shore is invisible, lost in the haze that the lake itself generates. Totora reed boats move across the water, their prows curved upward like the necks of swans, propelled by paddles or by simple reed sails. On the islands and the shores of the lake, the Uru people live on floating platforms of woven reeds, a way of life that predates the Inca by centuries and that continues in diminished and increasingly commercialized form to the present day. The island of the sun rises from the center of the lake, sacred beyond measure, the place where the creator god Viracocha called the sun and moon into being, where Manco, Capac, and Mama Oclo emerged from the waters to found the Inca dynasty. Pilgrims travel here from across the empire, and the temples and shrines that dot the island are maintained with the most meticulous care. To stand on the island of the sun is to stand at the origin point of the Inca world, the place where myth and geography converge in a landscape of water and light so striking that it makes the divine claims of the origin stories seem not just plausible, but obvious. Of course the sun was born here. Where else could it have been? South from Titicaca, the road continues into the territories of the Aymara-speaking peoples, the Lupaca, the Kala, the Pacajes, powerful groups whose incorporation into Tawantinsuyu was achieved through a combination of military force and strategic marriage alliance. These are a proud people, and their pride is evident in their architecture, their textiles, and their reluctance to abandon their own traditions in favor of Inca ones. The administrative compromise is visible on the ground. Inca-style buildings sit beside Aymara ones. Inca officials share authority with local lords whose families have governed these communities since before anyone in Cusco knew the name Pachacuti. The empire is thinner here, its grip less absolute, its control maintained as much by the presence of the road and the storehouses as by direct administration. The Seque system does not extend this far from Cusco. The sacred geography here belongs to the Aymara, and the Inca, for all their ambition, have been wise enough to accommodate it rather than attempt to replace it. Further south still, into the high desert of what is now Bolivia and northern Chile, where the air is so dry that corpses mummify naturally and abandoned buildings stand for centuries without decay. The road crosses salt flats that stretch to the horizon, blinding white under a sun that seems magnified by the altitude and the clarity of the atmosphere. The Salar de Uyuni, the largest salt flat on Earth, lies within the empire's boundaries, a landscape so surreal that it seems to belong to a different planet. After rain, the salt flat becomes a mirror stretching to infinity, reflecting the sky so perfectly that the horizon disappears, and the traveler walks suspended between two identical heavens, feet in one and head in the other. The Inca crossed this landscape. They built roads across it. They maintained tambos on its edges. They sent their chasqui runners sprinting across its surface, the salt crystals crunching beneath their sandaled feet, their messages racing across the reflected sky. And then, on the far side of the desert, the mountains descend toward the Pacific, and the road drops through one of the most extreme environmental gradients on Earth. From the frozen altiplano to the temperate valleys to the scorching coastal desert in the span of a day's travel, the air thickening and warming, the landscape drying and flattening until the road reaches the shore, and the ocean stretches westward into an infinity that even the Inca, for all their ambition, could not cross. Or could they? The question of Tupac Inca Yupanqui's Pacific voyage lingers unanswered and unanswerable at the western edge of the Inca world. The ocean that the Inca called Mama Cocha, Mother Sea, was both a boundary and an invitation. The coastal peoples of the empire were accomplished mariners who fished, traded, and traveled along the Pacific coast in reed and balsa craft of considerable sophistication. The Chincha, a coastal people absorbed into the empire, maintained a merchant fleet that traded up and down the coast and possibly beyond, exchanging spondylus shells, a material sacred to Andean peoples, for goods from as far north as Central America. The maritime dimension of the Inca world is often underappreciated, overshadowed by the drama of the highland conquests and the monumentality of the stone architecture. But the sea was as much a part of Tawantinsuyu as the mountains, and the people who sailed it were as essential to the empire's economy as the farmers who terraced the hillsides and the herders who pastured their flocks on the Puna. The coastal desert itself, where the road ran parallel to the sea, was a landscape of startling extremity. The Atacama, the driest desert on Earth, receives so little rainfall that some weather stations have never recorded a single drop. The land is bare rock, bare sand, bare mineral hardness under a sky that never clouds. And yet people lived here, sustained by rivers that descended from the Andes and by the extraordinary marine ecosystem of the Humboldt Current, which brought cold, nutrient-rich water upwelling from the deep ocean to the surface, supporting one of the most productive fisheries on the planet. The coastal peoples ate fish, shellfish, seabirds, and sea mammals. They irrigated narrow strips of coastal valley with mountain water, growing cotton, beans, squash, and the peppers that flavored their food. They built great adobe cities, the largest of which, Chan Chan, the conquered Chimu capital, covered 20 square kilometers and housed perhaps 60,000 people. The Inca administered these coastal territories through the same provincial system that governed the highlands, but the adaptation required was significant. The coastal peoples had their own traditions, their own gods, their own ways of doing things. They worshipped the sea and the moon more prominently than the sun. Their social structures, while hierarchical, operated on principles that did not always align with highland models. The Inca accommodated these differences to the extent that accommodation served their purposes, imposing the sun cult and the Maita and the road network, while leaving local religious practices and local leadership structures largely intact. The result was a patchwork of cultures held together by infrastructure and ideology, by the road that connected every community to Cusco, and by the idea that Cusco was the center of the world, and the Sapa Inca was the son of the sun, and everything depended on maintaining the chain of reciprocal obligation that ran from the humblest farmer on the driest coast to the golden throne in the navel of the world. The empire at its height was this: a system of extraordinary coherence imposed on a landscape of extraordinary diversity. No other pre-modern state managed such a range of environments within a single administrative framework. No other state without writing coordinated the labor and tribute of so many people across such vast distances. The achievement was genuine, profound, and unprecedented. It was also, in ways that only became apparent in the final years, desperately fragile. The fragility had several sources, and they reinforced one another in ways that made the system's strengths into its most dangerous vulnerabilities. The succession crisis was structural and inescapable. Each new Sapa Inca began his reign without the accumulated wealth of his predecessor, who retained his estates and his servants and his political network even in death. The pressure to conquer, to acquire new territories whose tribute could fund the new ruler's court and establish his independence from the Panicas of the dead meant that the empire was addicted to expansion. When expansion reached its geographical limits, as it had by the time of Huayna Capac, the system lost its primary mechanism for peaceful succession. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa was not an aberration. It was a structural inevitability, the predictable result of a succession system that required infinite expansion in a finite world. The concentration of authority in a single person meant that the removal of that person paralyzed the entire state. The Sapa Inca was not merely the chief executive. He was the cosmological keystone, the living link between the human and divine worlds. The person whose decisions were not policies but natural laws. There was no constitutional mechanism for governance in the absence of a legitimate ruler. There was no parliament, no senate, no council of elders with independent authority. When Atahualpa was captured at Cajamarca, the empire did not merely lose its leader. It lost the principle that made collective action possible. Generals with armies of tens of thousands waited for orders that never came because the only person authorized to give them was sitting in a stone room watching strangers melt his gods into bars. The road network and the tambo system, those magnificent instruments of imperial integration, also served as vectors for the spread of epidemic disease. Smallpox traveled the Capacñan faster than any army. Faster even than the chasqui runners, carried by travelers and traders who did not know they were infected until the symptoms appeared and by then had already passed the virus to dozens of others at the next tambo who carried it to the next tambo and the next, in a chain of transmission that the Inca infrastructure, designed for efficiency and speed, accelerated to devastating effect. The very connectivity that made the empire strong made it vulnerable to a threat that no Inca planner could have anticipated, because the threat came from outside the Inca universe entirely, from a world whose existence the Inca did not even suspect. And the ideology of reciprocity, that beautiful, coherent framework in which every act of obedience was balanced by an act of generosity, and every sacrifice was repaid by divine protection, could not survive the arrival of a catastrophe that the gods neither prevented nor explained. When smallpox killed Huayna Capac and his court, when it swept through communities that had faithfully maintained their huacas and fulfilled their mita obligations and made their offerings to the apus, the theological implications were shattering. The contract had been broken. The gods had not protected their people. The Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, the living guarantee of cosmic order, had died of a disease his divine father could neither cure nor explain. If the son could not save his own son, what was the meaning of the sacrifices, the labor, the obedience, the children sent to die on mountaintops in the thin air? The chronicles do not record the theological crisis in these terms, but its effects are visible in the speed with which Inca authority collapsed after Cajamarca. Subject peoples who had been held in the empire by a combination of force and ideological persuasion found that the ideological component had been shattered. The force remained, but force alone, without the legitimacy that the cosmic framework provided, was insufficient to maintain the loyalty of 10 million people spread across 30 degrees of latitude. When the Spanish arrived and began offering alternative alliances, many subject peoples calculated, reasonably enough, that cooperation with the newcomers offered better prospects than continued loyalty to a system that had visibly failed. The most devastating collaborations came from groups that the Inca had conquered recently or treated harshly. The Cañari of Ecuador, who had suffered brutal reprisals for their resistance to Inca conquest, allied eagerly with the Spanish. The Huanca of the Central Highlands, longtime rivals of Cusco, provided thousands of soldiers and critical logistical support to the conquistadors. The Chachapoya of the northern cloud forests, who had been subjected to forced resettlement and cultural suppression, saw the Spanish as liberators and fought alongside them against their Inca overlords. These alliances were not coerced. They were strategic choices made by peoples who saw in the Spanish arrival an opportunity to settle old scores and regain autonomy that the Inca had taken from them. The irony, of course, is that the Spanish had no intention of restoring autonomy to anyone. The peoples who allied with the conquistadors against the Inca would find, within a generation, that they had exchanged one imperial master for another, and that the new master's demands were heavier, his gods more intolerant, and his diseases more lethal than anything the Inca system had imposed. But that realization came later. In the immediate crisis of the 1530s, the fragmentation of Inca authority along the very fault lines that the empire's methods of conquest and control had created was one of the primary factors that allowed 168 men to bring down a state of 10 million. It is here, at the intersection of structural fragility and historical contingency, that the full tragedy of the Inca story comes into focus. Tawantinsuyu did not fall because it was weak. It fell because its strengths were of a specific kind that proved catastrophically vulnerable to a specific set of threats that arrived simultaneously and without precedent. The centralization of authority that made the empire efficient made it brittle. The road network that made it connected made it permeable to disease. The ideology that made it legitimate could not survive a crisis that its categories could not comprehend. The conquest methods that made expansion possible created subject populations ready to rebel at the first opportunity. A different set of threats, a drought, an earthquake, a conventional military challenge from a neighboring power might have been absorbed by the system, which had mechanisms for responding to all of these. But the combination of epidemic disease, the capture of the sacred ruler by an enemy from outside the known world, and the availability of iron, steel, horses, and gunpowder to that enemy created a convergence of catastrophes that no political system on Earth could have survived intact. The Inca were not defeated by European superiority. They were defeated by European difference, by threats that emerged from outside the conceptual universe within which Inca power operated and for which Inca political technology, however brilliant, had no response. The story of the Inca is not, in the end, a story of failure. It is a story of achievement so profound that its destruction required a combination of forces unprecedented in human history. And it is a story whose ending has not yet been written, because the people who built Tawantinsuyu are still here, still speaking their languages, still farming their terraces, still weaving their textiles, still looking up at the same stars that Pachacuti saw when he dreamed of a city shaped like a puma beneath a sky full of dark constellations. The mountains have not moved. The rivers still run. The stones still hold. And in the archives of Lima and Cusco, in the collections of museums in Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador, and in cities scattered across Europe and North America, the Quipus wait. Their knotted strings hang in climate-controlled cases, their colors faded but still distinguishable, their knots still tied in patterns that once meant something precise and urgent to the people who made them. Researchers photograph them, measure them, feed their dimensions into computer programs that search for patterns the human eye might miss. The question persists, tantalizing and unresolved. Are these strings merely numerical records, sophisticated abacuses frozen in chord? Or are they something more, something closer to writing, to narrative, to the stories that the Emotas memorized and the Sapa Inca commanded, and the Chasqui carried at a dead run along the roads that stitched the empire together? If we could read them, if the code could be broken and the strings could speak again, what would they tell us? Census figures, certainly, tribute records, inventories of storehouses, but perhaps also histories, perhaps the names of the rulers and the stories of their conquests, Perhaps the words of the prayers offered at the Coricancha when the solstice sun struck the golden disk. Perhaps the songs sung at the Inti Raymi, their rhythms encoded in the spacing of the knots. Perhaps the last messages sent by Atahualpa from his captivity, orders that arrived too late to save an empire. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the Quipus are exactly what the conservative interpretation says they are, numerical records and nothing more, and the narratives they carried were always in the memories of the men who read them, memories that died when those men died. Either answer is remarkable. Either answer testifies to a civilization that found a way to manage the information requirements of a continental empire through means that the literate world is still struggling to understand. And either answer points to the same conclusion, that the Inca achievement was not merely impressive for a people without writing. It was impressive. Full stop. It stands comparison with any administrative system of its era anywhere in the world, and in several respects it surpasses them. The sun sets over Cusco. The light drains from the sky in bands of gold and purple, and the stone walls of the old city darken from honey to amber to shadow. The temperature drops rapidly, as it always does at this altitude, and the people in the streets pull their coats tighter and walk faster, hurrying toward warmth and food and the companionship of their families. Above the city, the walls of Sacsayhuaman catch the last light on their highest stones, the enormous blocks turning briefly incandescent before they too surrender to the dusk. The stars emerge, first one, then a dozen, then 100, then the full blazing tapestry of the southern sky, the Milky Way arching overhead like a river of light, its dark constellations visible against the glow, the llama and the fox and the serpent, the same shapes that Pachacuti saw, the same shapes that every person who has ever stood on this ground and looked up has seen. The night belongs to the mountains now. The Apus stand in darkness, their peaks invisible against the sky except where starlight catches a remnant of snow and throws back a faint, cold gleam. They are patient, these mountains. They were here before the Inca. They were here before the Wari and the Tiwanaku and the Chavin. They will be here long after the last tourist has photographed Machu Picchu, and the last archaeologist has cataloged the last potsherd, and the last quipu has yielded its last secret, or kept it forever. But between the patience of the mountains and the brevity of human life, something extraordinary happened here. A people looked at this impossible landscape and decided it was not impossible at all. They terraced the slopes and channeled the rivers and built roads across the chasms and counted their people on knotted strings and carried their messages at a run across a continent and raised their temples to the sun and fitted their stones together so precisely that 5 centuries of earthquakes have not shaken them loose. They called their world Tawantinsuyu, the 4 parts together. And for a moment in time, brief by the mountain's reckoning but immeasurable by ours, they held those 4 parts together with nothing but string and memory, and the unshakable conviction that the sun was their father, and the earth was their mother, and the stones would hold. The stones held. They are holding still. And now we must speak of what came after the stones, after the roads, after the empire. Because the destruction of Tawantinsuyu did not end on the day Atahualpa died in the plaza at Cajamarca, or on the day Tupac Amaru was beheaded in Cusco, or even on the day the last Inca resistance at Vilcabamba was finally overwhelmed by Spanish soldiers cutting their way through cloud forest with swords that had been forged in Toledo and baptized in the blood of a continent. The destruction continued for centuries, and it took forms that the conquistadors could not have imagined, because the most devastating weapon the Spanish brought to the Americas was not steel or gunpowder or horses. It was time. Time did what swords could not. It wore away the edges of memory, smoothed the sharp contours of tradition, filled the spaces where knowledge had been with silence and forgetting. The Spanish conquest was an event, violent and sudden and comprehensible in its brutality. But the colonial period that followed was a process, slow and grinding and so pervasive that the people living through it could not always distinguish between what they were losing and what they had never had. The first generation after the conquest still remembered. They remembered the storehouses full of grain, and the roads swept clean, and the runners carrying messages faster than thought across the mountains. They remembered what it felt like to live inside a system that, whatever its demands, made a kind of cosmic sense. The old people told the children about the festivals, about the golden garden at the Coricancha, about the mummies of the ancestors who sat on their thrones and governed the living from the stillness of death. They told these stories in Quechua, in the evening, in houses that still smelled of smoke and wool and chuño, and the children listened with the particular intensity of those who sense that what they are hearing is already beginning to disappear. The second generation remembered less. They remembered the stories, but not the experiences behind them. The Coricancha was now Santo Domingo, its golden walls stripped bare, its chambers filled with Dominican friars chanting in Latin. The storehouses were empty or converted to Spanish use. The roads were still there, but they served Spanish purposes now, carrying silver to the coast, and priests to the provinces and orders from a viceroy in Lima, who answered to a king in Madrid who answered to a god the Inca had never heard of until he arrived uninvited and refused to leave. The children of this generation grew up bilingual, speaking Quechua at home and learning enough Spanish to navigate the colonial bureaucracy, and they inhabited a world that was neither fully Inca nor fully Spanish, but something bruised and provisional in between. By the third and fourth generations, the living memory of Tawantinsuyu had faded to myth. The empire became a golden age, recalled with the particular poignancy that attaches to things we know only through the words of people who knew them through the words of others. The precision of administrative detail blurred into generality. The specific mechanisms of the Mita and the Quipu became vague traditions rather than remembered practices. What remained was the emotional core, the conviction that once, before the bearded strangers came, the world had been ordered and whole and sufficient, and that its destruction was not merely a political catastrophe, but a cosmic wound that had never healed. This conviction was not nostalgia, though it contained nostalgia. It was not fantasy, though it borrowed the forms of fantasy. It was a theological position, held with the quiet tenacity of people who have been told that their gods are demons and their ancestors are damned, and their way of life is barbarism, and who have chosen, in the privacy of their hearts, not to believe it. The Indian concept of the Pachacuti, the world turning, the cataclysmic reversal that destroys the existing order and creates a new one, contained within it a radical promise. The world had turned before. It would turn again. The current age of suffering and subjugation was not permanent. It was a phase, a dark interval between one order and the next, and when the turning came, when the Pachacuti arrived, the world would be remade, and the broken things would be restored, and the dead would rise, and the empire would live again. This belief crystallized over the colonial centuries into a tradition that scholars call the Inkari myth. The name is a Quechua-Spanish hybrid, Inca plus rey, Inca plus king, and the myth exists in dozens of local variations collected from communities across the former Inca territory. The core narrative is remarkably consistent. After the Spanish killed the last Inca, they buried his body, or dismembered it and scattered the pieces across the land. But the body is not dead. It is growing beneath the earth,